Hello everyone, tonight I've got 15 special scary stories for all of you. I know many of you watch these videos to fall asleep, so before that, make sure to like the video and subscribe to Mr. Nightspook, and don't forget to comment below and tell me where you're from and what time you're watching. Now get comfortable and let's begin. Story 1. It was the first cheap roadside motel stay I spent completely alone. I thought the silence would be peaceful, until I realized it wasn't silence at all. I'm Carter Wellen. A few years ago I was driving across the country for a new job. I tried to push through the drive in 2 days, but by the second night my eyes were getting heavy. The highway was completely empty for miles, no streetlights, just my headlights cutting through the dark. I needed to sleep, so I pulled off at the next exit and found a faded one-story motel. The parking lot was mostly empty. Only 3 other cars were parked near the far end. I parked right in front of the office. A single fluorescent light buzzed over the front door. Inside, a guy in his 50s sat behind thick glass, staring at a small TV. I slid my ID under the gap and asked for a room for one night. He typed slowly, then slid my cards back along with 2 plastic keycards. I told him it was just me. He just looked at me and said, "Take them both, just in case." I thought it was a weird thing to say, in case of what, but I was too tired to argue, so I just walked out to my car. My room was number 114, around the back of the building. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The room smelled like stale smoke and old cleaning supplies. It was a standard cheap room, 1 bed, a heavy old TV, and a small nightstand. I locked the door behind me and threw the deadbolt. Then I emptied my pockets. I put my phone, my wallet, and both keycards right next to the lamp on the nightstand. I took a quick shower, trying to wash off the feeling of being on the road for 14 hours. When I got out, the room felt uncomfortably quiet. The only sound was the low hum of the mini fridge in the corner. I turned off the main lights, leaving only the dim yellow lamp by the bed, and got under the covers. It took me a while to actually fall asleep. Even though I was exhausted, I kept staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the fridge. Every now and then I thought I heard footsteps on the gravel outside, but when I listened closely there was nothing, just the wind. I rolled over and looked at the clock. It was 11:30 p.m. I closed my eyes. Just as I was about to drift off, a sound made my eyes snap open. A sharp, electronic beep from my front door. I froze. A second later I heard the heavy, mechanical click of the lock disengaging. Someone had just used a keycard on my door. I lay perfectly still in bed, staring across the dark room. I waited for the handle to turn, but nothing happened. The heavy deadbolt was still engaged, but they didn't even try the handle. 10 seconds passed, then 30. The silence came back. I felt uneasy. My stomach dropped a little. I tried to tell myself it was just a mistake. It was a dark, run-down motel. Someone probably got the wrong room, swiped their card, realized their error, and walked away. But I needed to be sure. I quietly stepped out of bed. The carpet felt damp under my bare feet. I walked over to the door as silently as I could and pressed my eye against the peephole. The walkway outside was dimly lit by a single bulb. It was completely empty. No one walking away, no doors closing, nothing, just the empty concrete path. I checked the deadbolt again to make sure it was fully locked. It was. I went back to bed, but I couldn't relax. The tiredness was completely gone now. Something felt off. I kept looking at the door, expecting to hear the beep again. I left the bedside lamp on. The 2 keycards were still sitting right where I left them, next to my phone. I stared at them, remembering the guy at the front desk, just in case. The next few hours were miserable. Every shadow in the room seemed to stretch and move when I looked away. My ears were constantly tuned to the sound of the door. I must have checked the peephole 3 more times between midnight and 2 in the morning. Every time the walkway was empty. Eventually, exhaustion started to win. My eyes got heavy, and despite how nervous I was, I drifted into a light, uncomfortable sleep. I woke up suddenly. The room was still dark. I looked at the clock. It was exactly 3 a.m. The motel was dead silent. I held my breath, listening. Then I heard it. Slow, deliberate footsteps dragging across the concrete walkway right outside my room. They stopped directly in front of my door. My heart started beating faster. A second later, the electronic lock let out a sharp beep. Then the heavy click, but this time it didn't stop there. The brass door handle slowly began to turn. It rotated down to the bottom. I heard a dull thud as the door pulled against the heavy metal deadbolt. Whoever was out there was trying to come in. I sat up in bed, my chest tight. I didn't make a sound. I watched the handle. It stayed held down for what felt like forever. Then very slowly it rotated back into place, but I didn't hear footsteps walking away. The person was still standing there. I carefully slid out of bed again. My legs felt weak, but I forced myself to walk toward the door. As I got closer, I looked down at the gap between the bottom of the door and the floor. The light from the walkway was blocked. A dark shadow stretched under the door into my room. Someone was standing right on the other side, practically leaning against the wood. I stood on my side of the door, completely frozen. I didn't want to look through the peephole. I was terrified that if I put my face to the glass, an eye would be looking right back at me. I just stared at the shadow blocking the light. I didn't hear them breathing or shuffling their feet. It was like they were standing perfectly still, waiting for me to unlock the deadbolt. My throat felt completely dry. I was afraid that making a sound would let them know I was right there, so we just stood there. Me on the inside, them on the outside. 5 minutes went by. The shadow didn't move. 10 minutes, still nothing. My bare feet were freezing on the damp carpet. Finally, after maybe 20 minutes, the shadow slowly shifted. The light from the walkway spilled back into my room through the gap. I heard the slow dragging of footsteps moving away, heading down the concrete path toward the back of the motel. I let out a breath and sat on the edge of the bed. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I just sat there, staring at the deadbolt, waiting for the sun to come up. When the gray morning light finally started filtering through the cheap curtains, I knew I had to get out of there. I grabbed my duffel bag and started throwing my clothes inside. I walked over to the nightstand to grab my phone and my wallet. I picked them up, shoving them into my pockets. Then I looked down at the empty space next to the lamp. My stomach dropped completely. The spot where I had placed the 2 plastic keycards the night before. There was only 1 keycard sitting on the nightstand. I stared at it, trying to process what I was looking at. I hadn't moved them. I hadn't touched them since I first walked into the room. There were 2 cards, now there was 1. My eyes slowly moved from the single keycard on the table to the deadbolt on the front door. The deadbolt was still locked from the inside, but someone had been in the room or someone else had the second card. I didn't stop to look for it. I grabbed my bag, unlocked the deadbolt, and practically ran out to my car. I didn't even stop by the front desk to check out. I just started the engine and sped out of the empty parking lot, getting back onto the highway as fast as I could. Have you ever checked into a room and felt like you weren't the only one there? Story 2. Back in my old apartment building, I worked the night shift at a gas station. I used to think the scariest thing I'd see was a drunk customer. I was wrong. My name is Eliza Corbett. At the time this happened, I was living alone in a 5-story brick apartment building on the edge of town. Because of my work schedule, I usually got home from my shift around 4:30 in the morning. My sleep schedule was completely backwards compared to a normal person, so I ended up doing all of my household chores when the rest of the building was dead asleep. That included my laundry. The shared laundry room for the tenants was down in the basement of the building. To get there, you had to take the main elevator down to the lobby, walk down a short, dimly lit hallway past the metal mailboxes, and then take a steep set of concrete stairs down behind a heavy, gray fire door. The basement itself was basically just a massive, unfinished concrete box. It always smelled strongly of damp earth and old, rusted pipes. The laundry machines were clustered tightly in one corner of the room under a single, constantly flickering fluorescent tube. There were 4 washers and 4 dryers down there, all of them older, heavy-duty industrial models. They had thick, yellowed plastic dials that you had to manually push in to start the cycle and pull out to stop it. I never really liked going down into that basement, especially in the middle of the night, but it was just a necessary part of my routine. I would toss my dirty work uniforms and everyday clothes into the drum, set a timer on my phone, and go back up to my apartment on the 3rd floor to unwind while I waited. It was a Tuesday morning when things started happening. I had just got home from my shift, feeling completely exhausted and smelling like gasoline and stale store coffee. I gathered up my heavy plastic laundry basket and made the trip down to the basement. It was completely silent down there, aside from the low, steady, vibrating hum of the water boiler in the far back room. I loaded my clothes into washer number 3, poured in my liquid detergent, and pushed the heavy plastic dial inward. The machine immediately shuddered to life, and I listened to the water loudly rushing into the metal drum. I left the basement, letting the heavy metal fire door slam shut behind me, and walked up the concrete stairs. Back in my apartment, I made myself a quick bowl of cereal and sat on my living room couch. The regular wash cycle on those machines usually took exactly 35 minutes. When my phone alarm finally went off with a sharp buzz, I grabbed my empty basket and headed back out into the silent hallway. I pulled open the basement door and walked over to the laundry area, but washer number 3 was completely silent. I looked closely at the control panel. The plastic dial was pulled out. The progress line showed that the cycle was only about halfway done. I lifted the lid, and the water inside was still soapy and completely still, soaking my clothes. I felt a little confused at first. I had definitely pushed the dial in all the way before I left. Those old machines were incredibly finicky, though. I figured that maybe if you didn't press the dial hard enough, the intense vibrations of the heavy spin cycle could cause the plastic piece to physically pop back out and pause the machine. It had never happened to me before, but it seemed like the only logical explanation at the time. I reached out and pushed the dial back in. The machine gave a loud, metallic clunk and started violently churning the soapy water again. I decided to just go back upstairs and wait another 20 minutes for it to finish. I went back to my apartment, turned the television on at a very low volume, and kept an eye on the clock. It was getting close to 5:15 a.m. now. Outside my living room window, it was still pitch black. When exactly 20 minutes had passed, I grabbed my basket again and made the trip back down. I opened the heavy metal door and stepped into the basement. Immediately, my stomach dropped. The room was dead silent again. The washer wasn't running at all. I walked slowly over to washer number 3. The dial was pulled out again. I looked at the cycle progress line printed on the plastic. It had only moved maybe 5 minutes from where I had just restarted it. I stood there staring at it. The dial hadn't just vibrated out on its own. I knew that for a fact now. Those thick plastic dials take actual physical effort to snap outward. I stood completely still in the damp, quiet basement. Something felt off. I looked around the large room. The wire cages for tenant storage were mostly empty, casting long, dark shadows against the bare concrete walls. Then I heard it. From the dark, narrow hallway that led back toward the boiler room, I heard footsteps. They were slow and deliberate. It sounded like rubber soles peeling off the slightly sticky, damp concrete floor. Stab, pausing, stab. They were moving away from the laundry area, retreating deeper into the dark, unfinished part of the basement. I froze in place. I didn't call out to see who was there. I didn't want whoever was back there in the dark to know I was listening to them. I just stood there next to the washer. The footsteps slowly faded away until they were entirely masked by the constant hum of the boiler. I felt uneasy, extremely uneasy. I wanted to just take my wet clothes and leave the basement immediately, but they were entirely soaked in heavy suds and dripping wet. I couldn't just carry them up 3 flights of stairs to my apartment like that. I needed the cycle to finish. I reached out, pushed the dial back in, and heard the machine loudly start up for the 3rd time. But this time, I wasn't going back up to my apartment. I decided I was going to wait and see what was happening, but I didn't want to just stand right there in the middle of the open laundry area where anyone could see me. I grabbed my empty basket and walked heavily toward the stairs, making sure my footsteps were loud on the concrete. I opened the heavy metal fire door, let it loudly slam shut behind me, and walked up a few steps. But I didn't keep going. Instead, I stopped completely. I waited on the stairs for a few seconds in total silence. Then, very carefully and quietly, I crept back down to the bottom landing. The fire door had a small, rectangular window with thick wire mesh embedded inside the glass. It looked directly out into the laundry area. I stood on the bottom step and pressed my face close to the dirty glass, keeping the rest of my body hidden safely behind the heavy metal frame of the door. From my angle, I could see washer number 3 perfectly. I could see the yellow dial, and I could see the dark opening of the hallway leading to the boiler room in the background. The machine was chugging along loudly, the water splashing forcefully against the inside of the metal drum. I stood there barely breathing, just watching. 5 minutes went by, then 10 minutes. My legs started to cramp from standing so rigidly on the concrete stairs. The air in the stairwell was cold, and my hands were gripping my plastic basket so tightly that my knuckles ached. I was actually starting to think my mind was just playing tricks on me, and that I was overreacting to a broken machine. But then the loud noise of the washing machine just stopped. It didn't slow down gradually, it just cut out instantly. I stared intently through the mesh window. The yellow dial on washer number 3 had popped out again. But there was absolutely no one standing in front of it. I squinted through the dirty glass, trying to make sense of what I was looking at. The fluorescent lighting was bad, but the concrete floor right in front of the machines was completely empty. I watched the machine closely. The dial had not just vibrated outward. I had seen it snap back, exactly the way it looks when a person grabs it and forcefully pulls. Then I saw the movement. The laundry machines weren't pushed flush against the back wall. There was a narrow gap of maybe 1.5 feet between the back of the heavy washers and the cinder block wall, where all the thick water hoses and drainage pipes ran. From behind the raised control panel of washer number 3, something quickly retreated back down into that narrow gap. It was just a brief, pale flash of a hand slipping down behind the metal machine, totally out of sight. Someone was wedged back there. Someone had been squeezed into the tight, dirty space between the cinder block wall and the back of the washing machines the entire time I was down there. They had been silently reaching up from behind the machine to pull the dial. I didn't open the door. I didn't go back in to get my clothes. I backed away from the window, turned around, and practically ran up the stairs. I didn't stop moving until I was inside my apartment on the 3rd floor with the deadbolt thrown and the heavy chain locked. I sat on my living room floor for the rest of the morning, jumping at every single small sound coming from the hallway. When the sun finally came up around 7:30 a.m., I called my landlord. I told him someone was hiding in the basement. He went down there with the building superintendent later that morning to check it out. They called me later and told me they didn't find anyone at all. They said the basement was empty, the boiler room was clear, and the exterior cellar storm doors were securely padlocked from the inside. But they did tell me they found something strange behind the washing machines. The heavy layer of dust on the concrete floor back there in the gap had been wiped completely clean, as if someone had been sitting or lying down in that tight space for a very long time. I abandoned the clothes that were sitting in washer number 3. I never went back for them. I just went to the store the next day and bought brand new uniforms for work. I never went back down into that basement, not even during the middle of the day when the building was full of awake people. I started taking my clothes to a public laundromat 3 blocks away, even though it was incredibly inconvenient for my schedule. I still live in that same apartment building. I haven't seen anything unusual since I stopped going to the basement, but every now and then, things inside my apartment still feel slightly wrong. Sometimes when I come home from a long shift at work, I'll find that my bedroom closet door is cracked open just a few inches, even though I know I shut it tight before I left. And a few times when I've pulled my clean clothes out of my dresser drawers, they've felt slightly damp, almost as if they've been handled by someone whose hands were wet. I try my best not to think about the smell of damp earth or the heavy click of a plastic dial pulling out. Do you ever feel like someone else is in your home with you? Story 3. This happened during my solo road trip. Everyone was afraid of what was outside, but my fear came from inside my own house. My name is Nalen Pierce. At the time, my house was a 24-foot Class C motorhome. I had sold most of my belongings, bought the used RV, and decided to live on the road for a year. It was my home on wheels. Everything I owned was in there with me. I was driving cross-country, taking the long way through the desert highways of the Southwest. I actually preferred driving at night. There was less traffic, no blazing sun beating down through the windshield, and the roads were almost completely empty. It was just me, the headlights, and the radio. It was around 11:30 p.m. when I decided to make my first stop. I was low on fuel and needed a coffee to keep myself awake. I pulled into an old, run-down gas station just off the interstate. Only a couple of the overhead lights under the canopy were actually working, casting long shadows across the concrete parking lot. I parked the RV by pump number 4, shut off the engine, and stepped outside. The air was cold and dead quiet. I grabbed the heavy nozzle, selected the cheapest gas, and started pumping. That was when I noticed the car. It was a dull gray sedan parked over by the side of the convenience store building. It wasn't parked at a gas pump, and it wasn't really in a marked parking space. It was just sitting there in the darkest part of the lot. The headlights were completely turned off, but I could hear the engine idling. It had a very distinct sound to it. It was a rhythmic, metallic ticking noise, like a bad fan belt or a struggling engine valve. I also noticed a large, deep dent on the front passenger side fender. I couldn't see anyone inside the vehicle because the windows were heavily tinted. I didn't think much of it. I figured it was just someone taking a break from driving, or maybe an employee's car. I finished pumping my gas, walked inside to pay, poured myself a large black coffee, and got back into my RV. The next couple of hours of driving were perfectly normal. I drank my coffee, listened to a late-night talk radio show, and kept my eyes on the road. The highway was completely desolate. I think I passed maybe 3 or 4 semi-trucks over the span of 100 miles. Around 2:15 a.m., my eyes started getting heavy. The coffee wasn't doing its job anymore. I knew I needed to stretch my legs, splash some cold water on my face, and use a restroom. I saw a blue reflective sign indicating a rest area coming up in 2 miles, so I put my blinker on and took the exit. This rest area was extremely small. It was just a brick building for the bathrooms and a few dozen parking spaces. There were 2 large semi-trucks parked way in the back of the lot, completely dark and silent. I pulled my RV into a spot relatively close to the bathroom building, grabbed my keys, and walked inside. The bathroom smelled strongly of cheap industrial cleaner. I used the facilities, washed my hands, and threw my wet paper towel into the trash can. I pushed the heavy metal door open and walked back out into the cold night air. I was looking down, shuffling through my keys to find the one for the RV door. When I looked up, my stomach dropped. Parked exactly 2 spaces away from my RV was the dull gray sedan. I stopped walking and just stared at it. It was the exact same car. It had the same dark, heavily tinted windows. It had the same deep, ugly dent on the front passenger fender. And even from 20 feet away, I could hear that same rhythmic, metallic ticking sound coming from the idling engine. I felt uneasy. It was a very weird situation. Out of all the possible places to stop on this massive stretch of barren highway, they had stopped at the exact same two places I did. I tried to rationalize it. I told myself it was just a coincidence. We were obviously traveling the same route in the same direction. It made logical sense that we would both need to stop at similar intervals, but despite what I was telling myself, something felt off. The way the car was parked, facing my RV with no one getting out. It was just sitting there, running in the dark. I didn't waste any more time. I walked quickly to the driver's side door of my RV, climbed inside, and immediately pressed the lock button. I turned the key in the ignition, put it in drive, and pulled out of the rest area a lot faster than I normally would. Once I was back on the highway, I kept my eyes glued to the rearview mirror. I kept waiting to see a pair of headlights appear out of the darkness behind me. I watched the mirror for 5 minutes, then 10 minutes, then 20 minutes. Nothing. The road behind me stayed completely black. I started to relax a little bit. I convinced myself I was just letting my imagination get the best of me. I was tired, I was alone, and I was getting paranoid over nothing. I drove for another 2 solid hours. It was now approaching 4:30 a.m. and I was completely exhausted. I knew I couldn't keep driving safely. I needed to sleep for at least a few hours before the sun came up. Up ahead in the distance, I saw the towering, bright neon signs of a massive 24-hour travel plaza. It was a huge truck stop with dozens of gas pumps, a diner, and a massive parking lot. It was well lit and busy enough to feel safe. I took the exit and pulled into the sprawling parking lot. Because my RV was large, I decided to park on the far right side of the lot, near a line of trees. It was further away from the main building and the bright overhead lights, which would make it easier to sleep. I pulled into a spot, put the RV in park, and turned off the engine. I just sat in the driver's seat for a minute in the sudden quiet, taking a deep breath and rubbing my tired eyes. I didn't get up right away to go into the back bedroom. I was just enjoying the feeling of not moving. About 5 minutes later, a vehicle slowly turned down the lane I was parked in. It was moving at an absolute crawl. The headlights were off. It was only driving by the dim orange glow of its parking lights. It rolled to a stop in the parking space directly across from my windshield, maybe 20 feet away. It was the dull gray sedan. The dent on the fender was barely visible in the dim ambient light of the travel plaza, but I knew it was there. And even with my RV windows rolled up, I could hear that faint, rhythmic ticking of the engine cutting through the quiet night. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. My heart started beating harder against my ribs. This was absolutely not a coincidence anymore. There were literally hundreds of open parking spots in this massive travel plaza, and they chose the one directly in front of me, in the darkest, most isolated corner of the lot. I sat frozen. I watched the dark windshield of the sedan, desperately trying to see any outline or movement inside. Nothing happened. Nobody opened a door. Nobody rolled down a window. Nobody turned on a dome light. The car just sat there, idling quietly in the dark. For 15 minutes we were deadlocked, just two vehicles facing each other in the empty lane. The silence was suffocating. I felt incredibly exposed sitting in the large glass cab of the RV. I was way too uncomfortable to just get up, walk to the back of my RV, and go to sleep. I felt like I was being watched by a predator. I decided I was leaving. I wasn't going to stay there and wait to see what this person wanted. I reached forward and turned my key in the ignition. The RV engine roared to life. I shifted into reverse, backed out of the space clumsily, shifted into drive, and hit the gas. I didn't even look over at the sedan as I passed it. I just drove straight down the lane toward the exit of the travel plaza. As I merged onto the dark service road that led back to the highway on-ramp, I glanced at my side mirror. Back in the parking lot, the headlights of the gray sedan suddenly flicked on. It slowly pulled out of the parking space and started driving toward the same exit I had just taken. I pressed the gas pedal down hard. The RV was heavy and sluggish, but I pushed the engine as fast as it could safely go down the on-ramp. I merged onto the empty interstate, my heart pounding in my throat. I stared intensely at my side mirrors, waiting for those headlights to come rushing up behind me and ride my bumper. I drove for 3 miles, then 5 miles, then 10 miles. Nothing. The gray sedan never merged onto the highway. I never saw where it went. I kept checking my mirrors frantically for the next hour, but the dark road remained completely empty. It wasn't behind me anymore either. I should have felt relieved. I should have felt like I finally lost them. I finally started to calm down. The sky was just starting to turn a dark, bruised purple as the sun prepared to rise. I turned the radio completely off so I could just sit in silence and listen to the hum of the heavy tires on the pavement. I took a long, deep breath. That's when I heard it. It was faint at first, coming from the back bedroom area of my RV. A slow, rhythmic, metallic ticking sound. Then, one of the wooden floorboards in the narrow hallway directly behind me creaked under the weight of someone stepping on it. I was going 65 miles an hour down an empty highway, and I wasn't alone. Have you ever checked your rearview mirror and realized you were looking in the wrong direction the whole time? Story 4. This happened on a cold winter night. I thought the tapping on my window was just branches, but it was. My name is Brielle Cavanaugh. Back then, I lived in a quiet, older apartment complex. It was a garden-style layout, meaning the front doors faced each other across an outdoor concrete breezeway. My apartment was on the ground floor. The unit directly across from mine, number 4B, had been vacant for at least 4 months. The previous tenant moved out at the end of summer, and the leasing office hadn't found anyone new yet. I honestly liked having the empty space next door. It meant more privacy and less noise when I was coming home late from work. My living room window faced the breezeway. There was a large bush planted right in front of the glass. Since it was winter, the branches were completely bare. Whenever the wind picked up, the thin wood would lightly scrape against the window pane. I was entirely used to the sound. One Tuesday night, I was sitting on my couch watching a movie. It was around 11:30 p.m. The wind was blowing outside, making the usual scratching noises. But then, I heard a very distinct tapping sound against the glass. Tap, tap, tap. I ignored it at first. I figured it was just the bush hitting the glass at a weird angle, but a few minutes later it happened again. Tap, tap, tap. Something felt off. The rhythm was too steady. The wind usually makes a random, erratic scratching noise. This was spaced out perfectly. It sounded exactly like someone taking a single knuckle and knocking on the window pane. I muted the TV and sat perfectly still, listening. The tapping stopped. After a minute of silence, I convinced myself I was just being paranoid. I stood up to get a glass of water from the kitchen. On my way back to the couch, I stopped at my front door. I glanced out the peephole. I don't really know why I did it. It's just a habit I have sometimes when I'm alone late at night. When I looked through the glass lens, my stomach dropped. The door to the empty apartment across the breezeway was open, just a crack. It wasn't swung wide open, maybe only 2 or 3 inches. The inside of the apartment was completely pitch black. The amber hallway light outside cast a faint glow on the metal doorframe, but it didn't illuminate anything inside. I stood there staring at it for a long time. I knew for a fact the door had been closed when I got home from work at 5. I remembered because I had dropped my car keys on my welcome mat and had to pick them up right in front of that door. I tried to think logically. I figured the maintenance guys had been inside doing repairs during the day and just forgot to pull it shut all the way. A strong gust of wind probably blew it open. It made sense. I double-checked my own deadbolt, turned off all the lights in the living room, and went to bed. The next morning when I left for work, I looked across the breezeway. The door was shut completely. I didn't think much of it. Someone from the leasing office must have walked by and closed it, or maybe a draft slammed it shut in the morning. The rest of the day went by normally. I got home from work around 6 p.m. The door across the hall was still shut tight. I cooked dinner, did some laundry, and sat down in the living room just like any other evening. Around 10:15 p.m., the tapping started again. Tap, tap, tap. This time it was slightly louder. I paused my TV show. I sat completely still on the couch, staring at the closed blinds covering the living room window. I waited. 10 seconds later, the sound happened again. 3 distinct, deliberate taps against the glass. I felt incredibly uneasy. I stood up and walked very quietly over to the window. I grabbed the plastic wand and twisted it slowly, opening the blinds just a fraction of an inch so I could see out. The breezeway was completely empty. The motion sensor light attached to the building wasn't triggered. The bare branches of the bush were perfectly still. There was no wind tonight. I let go of the wand and took a slow step back. I walked over to the front door and pressed my eye against the peephole again. My breath caught in my throat. The door to the empty apartment was open again. This time it wasn't just a crack, it was open about halfway. The inside of the apartment was still a void of pure black. There were no lights on inside. There was no movement. It was just an open doorway leading into an empty, dark space. I grabbed my phone from the kitchen counter. I thought about calling the police, but I hesitated. What would I even say to them? That an empty apartment door was open? They would just tell me it was a property management issue and to call maintenance in the morning. I made sure my front door was locked tight, pulled the living room curtains shut, and went straight to my bedroom. I made sure to lock my bedroom door too. I had a lot of trouble falling asleep. I kept straining my ears, listening for any sounds coming from outside. Sometime around 2:30 a.m. I woke up. I didn't know what woke me at first. The apartment was completely silent. I lay there in the dark, staring up at the ceiling. Then I heard it. A soft, dragging sound. It was coming from outside, across the breezeway. It sounded like something heavy being pulled slowly across the concrete ground. I sat up in bed, my heart was beating fast. The sound was faint, but in the dead of night, it was clear enough to hear through the walls. It was coming from inside the empty unit. Someone was inside the apartment. I got out of bed and walked barefoot out of my bedroom. I crept down the short hallway toward the front door. I didn't turn on a single light. I moved as quietly as I could, terrified that whatever was out there would hear my footsteps. I pressed my eye against the peephole. The hallway was still lit by the dim amber bulb above our doors. The door across the hall was still open halfway, but now something was different. I squinted, trying to make sense of the heavy shadows. Just inside the doorway of the dark apartment, sitting on the floor, was a large black trash bag. At least that's what it looked like at first. It was bulky and shapeless, but as I kept staring at it, the shape shifted slightly. It wasn't a bag, it was a person. Someone was sitting cross-legged on the floor, just inside the darkness of the empty apartment, and they were facing directly toward my door. I pulled away from the peephole immediately. I pressed my back tightly against my own front door and put my hand over my mouth to keep from making any noise. I stood there in the dark for what felt like hours. I didn't hear the dragging sound again. I didn't hear footsteps walking away. I just stood there, completely frozen, knowing that someone was sitting just a few feet away on the other side of the wood. Eventually, I went back to my bedroom, locked the door, and stayed awake until the sun came up. At 7 a.m., it was fully light outside. I felt brave enough to look again. I went to the peephole. The door to the empty apartment was shut. I let out a long, shaking breath. I opened my front door, planning to head straight to my car and drive to the leasing office. But as soon as I stepped outside, I froze in my tracks. My doormat was gone. I looked down at the bare concrete in front of my door. I always had a cheap, brown welcome mat sitting right outside. It wasn't the kind of thing that could just blow away. I looked across the breezeway. My doormat was sitting, perfectly centered, directly in front of the door to the empty apartment. Someone had walked over to my door in the middle of the night, picked up my mat, dragged it across the concrete, and placed it in front of their door. I didn't knock, I didn't try to get my mat back. I walked as fast as I could to my car, locked the doors, and drove straight to the property manager's office. I sat in my car until they opened at 8. When the manager unlocked the doors, I walked in and told him everything. I told him about the open door, the tapping on my window, the dragging sound, the person sitting in the dark, and my doormat. He looked very concerned. He grabbed a set of master keys and told me to wait in his office while he went to check the unit with one of the maintenance workers. I sat in a plastic chair in the lobby for 20 minutes, tapping my foot nervously. When the manager finally came back, he looked pale. He sat down at his desk and sighed heavily. He told me they searched the entire apartment, but nobody was inside. The back bedroom window had been forced open from the outside, and the lock was completely broken off, but that wasn't the worst part. He said there was absolutely nothing in the apartment, except for a dirty sleeping bag shoved into the bedroom closet. And right next to the sleeping bag, sitting in a neat little pile on the floor, were dozens of small rocks. They were smooth, gray pebbles, the exact kind of rocks you would find in the landscaping outside my living room window. The kind you would use to tap against glass without leaving a scratch. I broke my lease that exact same day. I drove back to the apartment with a police officer, packed only what I needed into my car, and stayed at a friend's house until I could hire movers to get the rest of my furniture. I never stayed another night in that unit. The movers went in during broad daylight the following week. I stayed in the parking lot the entire time. When they were finishing up, one of the guys walked over to my car holding something in his hand. It was a piece of lined notebook paper. He said he found it slipped underneath my front door, resting on the inside of my apartment. It must have been pushed under the gap after I had left. I unfolded the paper. There was no writing on it. It was just a crude pencil drawing. It was a picture of a door slightly open with a welcome mat in front of it, and drawn sitting directly on the mat was a stick figure looking outward. I crumpled the paper up and threw it away in a gas station trash can. I don't know who was living in that empty apartment or how long they had been watching me before I finally noticed. But there is one detail I still think about late at night when I can't sleep. When I finally looked through the peephole and saw that shape sitting in the darkness, How long were they sitting there before I looked out? Story 5. During my late shifts at a nearly empty office building, I was staying in a basement apartment. At first, the noises upstairs seemed normal, until I realized they weren't coming from upstairs. Let me explain, my name is Declan Rourke. I say staying, but I really mean working. A few years ago, I got a job doing data entry for a logistics firm. They had just purchased a massive, multi-story commercial building on the edge of the city. The main floors were completely gutted for renovations, so my department was temporarily set up in the old building's superintendent's living quarters, a converted basement apartment on the lowest level. Because of the nature of the data, I worked the late shift. I clocked in at 4 in the afternoon and usually didn't leave until midnight. For most of my shift, I was the only person in the entire building, aside from a single security guard stationed up in the main lobby. The building was so large that even if someone was walking around on the first floor, I wouldn't hear them. The basement was essentially a concrete bunker. The apartment still felt like a living space. There was a small bathroom off to the side, a kitchenette that used to be a real kitchen, and a large main room where my desk was pushed up against the far wall. The walls were painted a dull, lifeless beige, and the floor was covered in cheap, faux wood laminate that echoed every single footstep. My job was incredibly boring. I spent 8 hours a day typing tracking numbers from paper manifests into a digital database. When you sit in a quiet room doing repetitive tasks for that long, your senses start to heighten. You start to pick up on little details you would normally ignore. For me, that detail was my office chair. It was a heavy black mesh chair with a solid plastic base. It wasn't particularly comfortable, but it had one defining feature. One of the wheels had a very distinct squeak. It was a short, sharp, metallic sound that happened whenever the wheel rotated against the laminate floor. I heard that sound 20 times a night. Every time I shifted my weight or reached for a file, there was that sharp little squeak. I'm a very meticulous person, especially when it comes to my workspace. I have a strict routine. Every single night before I left at midnight, I would organize my papers, power down my monitor, and push the chair perfectly flush against the edge of the desk. I would make sure the armrests were perfectly parallel to the table. It was just a habit, but it meant I knew exactly how I left my area. It was a Tuesday when I first noticed something felt off. I arrived at 4, unlocked the heavy basement door, and walked over to my desk to start my shift. I went to set my bag down and I paused. The chair wasn't flush against the desk. It was pulled out about a foot. It was a small thing, completely harmless on its own, but it caught my attention immediately because of how obsessive I am about pushing it in. I stood there staring at the gap. I naturally assumed there was a logical explanation. I figured the daytime manager or maybe a cleaning person had come down, sat at my desk to check a note, and just forgot to push the chair back in. I didn't dwell on it. I grabbed the back of the chair, pushed it in, heard that familiar metallic squeak, and started my shift. I forgot about it entirely by the time my shift ended. At midnight, I made absolutely sure to push the chair in tight. I even tapped the back of it twice to make sure it was flush against the wood before I turned off the lights and locked the door behind me. Wednesday afternoon, I arrived for my shift. I unlocked the door. The room was completely silent. I walked over to the desk. The chair was pulled out again. This time, it wasn't just pulled back a foot. It was pulled out almost 2 feet, and it was slightly angled. It looked exactly like someone had been sitting in it, facing the center of the room, and had just stood up and walked away without pushing it back. My stomach dropped slightly. It wasn't fear exactly, but just a strange feeling of unease. Something felt off. I checked my desk drawers. Nothing was missing. The computer was still fully powered down. I decided to walk up to the ground floor and talk to Mike, the security guard in the lobby. He was an older guy who spent most of his shift reading paperback thrillers. I asked him casually if anyone had been down in the basement that morning. I mentioned the cleaning crew, or maybe it. Mike looked at his logbook and shook his head. He told me the basement level was strictly restricted while the renovations were happening upstairs. He said no one had keycard access down there except me and the facility manager, who was currently out of state for a conference. I thanked him and went back down to the basement. Now I felt genuinely uneasy, if no one had been down there who was moving my chair. That night before I left, I decided to do something about it. I always put my pens in the top drawer and lined up my keyboard with the edge of the monitor stand. I pushed the chair in perfectly tight against the desk. I took out my phone and took a clear picture of how it looked. Then I backed out of the room, turned off the lights, and locked the door. Thursday afternoon, I came in for my shift. I unlocked the basement door. The moment I pushed the door open, my eyes went straight to the desk. The chair was completely pulled out. It wasn't just sitting near the desk anymore. It was sitting right in the middle of the room. It was positioned exactly halfway between my desk and the kitchenette area, facing the dark corner of the room. I froze in the doorway. I pulled out my phone and opened the picture from the night before. There was no denying it. I hadn't made a mistake. Someone or something was actively moving the chair while I wasn't there. I walked into the room and immediately checked the door lock. It wasn't forced or tampered with. I checked the small glass block windows near the ceiling. They were completely painted shut and covered in dust from the outside. There was absolutely no way anyone could get in that way. I spent my entire shift that night on edge. I kept looking over my shoulder. Every time the old building settled or the pipes creaked, I jumped. I felt like I was being watched. The room didn't feel empty anymore. I barely got any work done. I just wanted my shift to end so I could get out of there. Friday night was supposed to be my last shift of the week, but because I had been so distracted the night before, I had a massive backlog of shipping files to get through. My manager called and asked if I could stay a few hours late to finish them up. I agreed because I needed the extra money, but I dreaded the idea of being down there longer than I had to. By 2:30 a.m., the entire building was completely dead. The silence in the basement was heavy. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It felt thick, almost suffocating. The air conditioning had kicked off around 1, leaving the room feeling stale and warm. I was sitting at my desk, typing away. My back was to the rest of the room. My eyes were starting to burn from staring at the bright monitor in the dark room, so I decided to take a quick screen break. I stood up, automatically pushed my chair in tight against the desk out of pure habit, and walked over to the kitchenette area to grab a bottle of water. The mini fridge was about 20 feet away from my desk, sitting against the opposite wall. I walked over, opened the fridge door, and grabbed a water bottle. The low hum of the fridge compressor was the only sound in the room. I pushed the fridge door shut. The hum stopped and the heavy silence rushed back in. Then I heard it. Squeak, a short, sharp metal sound. It was the distinct sound of my office chair's wheel rolling across the laminate floor. The squeak wasn't loud, but in that dead silent room, it sounded like a firecracker. I stopped breathing, my stomach completely dropped. The sound had come from right behind me, back near the desk. At first, the noises upstairs seemed normal, until I realized they weren't coming from upstairs. All night, I thought the faint shifting sounds were just the empty floors above me settling, but they weren't. They were coming from inside the room with me. I stood frozen by the fridge, clutching the cold water bottle in my hand. I did not want to turn around. I just wanted to run for the door, but I had to know. I slowly turned around to look at the desk. The chair was no longer pushed flush against the wood. It had rolled out about 3 feet into the room. And it was slowly turning. I watched in absolute silence as the heavy black mesh chair rotated smoothly on its base. It turned until it was facing my computer monitor, exactly where I had been sitting just 2 minutes ago. Then it stopped. There was no one in the room. The air was completely still. There were no drafts, no uneven floors that could explain the movement, and definitely nothing that could make it turn and stop with such deliberate purpose. I didn't stay to investigate. I didn't try to rationalize it anymore. I dropped the water bottle on the counter, grabbed my car keys from my pocket, and walked straight out the basement door. I didn't grab my jacket. I didn't turn off the lights. I didn't even lock the door behind me. I walked up the stairs faster than I ever have in my life. I walked right past the security desk and out the front doors into the cold night air. I got into my car, locked the doors, and drove home without looking back. I spent the entire weekend trying to convince myself my mind was playing tricks on me due to sleep deprivation, but deep down, I knew what I saw. On Monday afternoon, I went back. I brought the daytime facility manager with me, making an excuse that I had left some personal items behind and needed help carrying a box. When we walked down the stairs and pushed open the basement door, everything was exactly as I had left it. The overhead lights were still on. My computer monitor had gone to sleep. And the office chair was still sitting 3 feet away from the desk. But it wasn't facing the computer monitor anymore. It was turned completely around. It was facing the door. Like it had been sitting there all weekend, just waiting for me to come back. I walked over, grabbed my jacket, and handed the manager my keycard right there on the spot. I told him I quit, and I walked out of the building for the last time. I still think about that basement sometimes when I'm working late at my new job. Have you ever felt like you weren't truly alone in an empty room?
Story 6.
Around my time working late-night shifts at a fast food drive-thru, I started getting strange notifications from my security camera. The weird part was the camera wasn't even plugged in. My name is Tessa Morrow. A few years ago, I worked the graveyard shift at a small, standalone burger place just off a quiet highway exit. We locked the lobby doors at 10 p.m. sharp every night. After that, we only served customers through the drive-thru window until we closed at 3 a.m. Usually it was just me and one cook working the back grill, but on slower weeknights, management would send the cook home at midnight to save on labor costs. That meant from midnight until 3 a.m., I was completely alone in the building. The layout of the restaurant was a little weird. The drive-thru speaker box was located about 40 feet away from the actual pickup window, around a sharp corner of the brick building. Because of the curve of the wall, there was a massive blind spot. If you were standing at the register inside, you couldn't actually see the speaker box or the menu board. To see if cars were waiting, we relied on a small, old black and white lane monitor mounted high up on the wall near the ceiling. It was grainy, but it showed the area directly next to the speaker. About a month before all this happened, my manager had installed a new, modern security camera right above the speaker box because kids kept stealing the plastic letters off the menu board. Since I was the night shift lead, he made me download the camera app on my personal phone so I could keep an eye on things when I was alone. But it didn't last long. About a week before my first strange encounter, a wide delivery truck backed in too close to the speaker and completely severed the power cord for the new camera. The frayed wire was just left dangling against the brick wall. The camera was dead. It had no power, and my app had showed it as offline ever since. For taking orders, I wore a standard wireless headset. The system was voice-activated by a heavy magnetic sensor buried under the pavement right next to the speaker box. When a car drove over the metal plate, the weight of the vehicle triggered the sensor. My headset would let out a loud double chime, and the microphone feed outside would automatically open so I could take the order. It was a Tuesday night, right around 1:15 a.m. The store was completely empty. The cook had left over an hour ago. I was alone, wiping down the stainless steel prep counters near the fry station. The only sound in the building was the low, steady hum of the walk-in refrigerators and the smell of stale grease in the air. Suddenly, my headset gave the familiar double chime. I stopped wiping the counter, wiped my hands on my apron, and pressed the button on the side of my headset. "Welcome in, order whenever you're ready," I said. There was no answer. Usually, even if a customer takes a minute to decide, you can hear the rumble of their engine idling. You can hear their car radio playing faintly, or the sound of the wind blowing past their windows. But I didn't hear an engine. I only heard a faint, scratchy static. I figured it was just a glitch in the old system. Sometimes, large commercial trucks driving down the nearby highway would vibrate the ground enough to accidentally trigger the magnetic plate in our lane. I clicked the headset off and went back to cleaning the counter. 10 minutes later, the double chime went off again. I pressed the button. "Hello, take your time and order when you're ready." Again, there was no engine noise, but this time the static sounded a little different. Beneath the low hum of the microphone, I could hear something faint. It sounded like air moving slowly back and forth across the speaker outside. I thought maybe the wind was picking up. I walked over to the drive-thru window and peered outside, but the trees across the street were perfectly still. No branches were moving. I clicked the headset off, feeling a little annoyed that the old equipment was acting up. The rest of my shift passed normally, and I locked up at 3 a.m. without giving it another thought. 2 nights later, it happened again. It was Thursday. Once again, it was just me in the store after midnight. The lobby was completely dark, with all the chairs stacked upside down on the tables. The only light inside came from the harsh fluorescent bulbs over the kitchen grill. It was exactly 2:30 a.m. I knew the time because I had just looked up at the wall clock, mentally counting down the last 30 minutes of my shift. The double chime sounded in my ear. I tapped the button, "Welcome in, order when you're ready." Silence, but the microphone feed stayed completely open. I stood there listening carefully. The scratchy static was present, but that sound of moving air was back. Only this time it was much clearer. It wasn't wind, it was breathing. It was heavy, rhythmic breathing. It sounded deep and slightly wet, like whoever was doing it had their face pressed uncomfortably close to the metal grating of the speaker box. My stomach dropped. I felt completely uneasy. The sound wasn't coming from someone sitting inside a car a few feet away. The breathing was directly on the microphone. I walked over to the drive-thru window and leaned against the glass, peering out into the dark parking lot. Because of the blind spot, I couldn't see the speaker box itself. I could only see the empty asphalt lane leading up to my window. There were no headlights cutting through the dark. There was no reflection of taillights bouncing off the brick wall. "Hello," I said into the headset, trying to sound normal. "Is someone out there?" The breathing didn't stop, but the rhythm of it changed. It grew slightly faster, slightly shallower. Whoever was standing out there had heard me. They were listening. I quickly reached up and clicked the headset off. The sudden silence inside the empty kitchen felt heavy. I stood by the window for a long time, just watching the edge of the brick wall, waiting to see if anyone would walk around the corner. Nobody did. No cars drove off. The lane stayed completely empty for the rest of the night. By the time the weekend arrived, I was dreading my late shifts. I tried to convince myself it was just a prank. Maybe some teenagers were messing around, trying to scare the late-night workers, but that didn't make sense. It takes the weight of a car to trigger the magnetic plate under the concrete. A person standing there shouldn't be heavy enough to open the microphone feed. Saturday night was much busier, which helped distract me. We had a steady line of cars coming through until about 2 a.m. After that, it died down completely. The cook cleaned his station and left right at 2:15. I decided to start my closing routine early. I just wanted to finish my tasks and get out of there. I was standing near the back sink, scrubbing down a pile of metal grease traps. I had taken my headset off and set it down on the metal prep table next to me because it was starting to give me a headache. As I was scrubbing a tray, I realized the kitchen was dead silent. Then I heard a faint, tinny sound. It was coming from the headset resting on the table. I stopped moving. I looked over at the headset. I hadn't heard the loud double chime, but the small green indicator light on the side of the earpiece was illuminated. That meant the microphone feed was open. The sensor outside had been triggered. I didn't want to pick it up. I slowly leaned over the table, bringing my ear close to the black foam pad of the earpiece. It was the breathing. This time it was incredibly loud. The person wasn't just close to the speaker box anymore. They were right up against it. I could hear the wet sound of lips parting, the sharp intake of air, and the slow, shaky exhale. Something felt completely wrong. This didn't feel like a random prank anymore. It felt deliberate. It felt like they were waiting for me. I carefully picked the headset up off the metal table. My hands started to shake. I held the earpiece to my ear, took a deep breath, and pressed the talk button on the side. "Hello," I whispered. The breathing stopped instantly. The dead silence on the other end was somehow worse than the breathing. I held my breath, waiting for a laugh, a voice, or the sound of footsteps running away. Nothing, just the faint background hum of the open microphone outside. I kept the headset pressed to my ear and slowly backed away from the sink. I walked toward the front counter. I needed to see the lane monitor. I reached the register and looked up at the old, grainy black and white screen. It was mostly dark, lit only by the glowing menu board outside. When I checked the empty lane camera, there was a shadow right up against the speaker pole. It wasn't a car, it was a figure. It was incredibly tall and unnaturally thin, standing so close to the metal speaker box that its shape almost blended into the pole. It was standing completely motionless, directly over the magnetic plate in the pavement. My chest felt tight. I couldn't make out any facial features on the screen. It was just a dark, solid silhouette against the faint light. Suddenly, my phone vibrated in my apron pocket. I jumped slightly. I pulled my phone out and looked at the screen. It was a banner notification from the security camera app. Motion detected at drive-through lane. I stared at the notification. The camera wasn't even plugged in. The wire was still completely severed. I had just seen the cut cord hanging from the brick wall when I took the trash out earlier that evening. It was impossible. My thumb hovered over the screen. Slowly, I tapped the notification. The app opened, a loading circle spun on a black background for a few seconds. Then an image flashed onto my screen. It wasn't a live video feed. It was a single, still photograph. It was a clear snapshot of the speaker box, but the angle of the picture was completely wrong. The camera was supposed to be mounted high up on the brick wall, looking down at the cars. This image was taken from down low. It was angled from the ground, looking directly up at the speaker box. And right in the bottom corner of the frame, taking up almost a third of the picture, was a pale, smudged face. It was blurry, like the person had moved incredibly fast right as the picture was taken. The eyes were wide and completely dark, and the mouth was hanging open in an unnatural way. A second later, the image completely disappeared from my screen, replaced by a gray error message that read, "Camera offline." I dropped my phone. It hit the floor with a loud crack. At that exact moment, the headset still pressed against my ear crackled to life. It wasn't the breathing this time. It was the sound of footsteps. I heard heavy, slow footsteps crunching on the loose gravel near the edge of the pavement outside. The footsteps weren't moving away from the speaker box. They were moving past it. They were heading down the narrow drive-through lane. They were walking toward the window. I dropped the headset on the counter. I turned around and sprinted down the hallway toward the back office. I practically threw myself inside, slammed the heavy metal door shut, and threw the deadbolt. I pushed the heavy filing cabinet in front of the door and sat on the floor in the dark. I used the office landline to call the police. I told the dispatcher someone was trying to break into the restaurant. I sat there in the dark, staring at the locked door, listening for any sound from the kitchen. The police arrived about 10 minutes later. They knocked on the front glass doors, and I finally came out to let them in. They checked the entire perimeter of the building. They checked the bushes, the dumpster area, and the empty parking lot. They found absolutely nothing. They looked at the old lane monitor, which just showed an empty drive-through lane. I tried to show them the picture on my phone, but the notification was completely gone from my history. There was no image saved. The app just said the camera was disconnected, exactly like it had for the past week. The officers stayed with me in the lobby until my manager arrived to relieve me at 6 a.m. I handed my manager the keys, told him I was quitting, and walked out the front door into the morning light. I never went back to that restaurant again. I still don't know who or what was standing out there. I don't know how they were heavy enough to trigger the car sensor, or how a camera with a severed power cord managed to take a picture and send it to my phone. But the thing that bothers me the most is the timing. Every single time I heard the breathing, it started around 2:30 a.m., the exact time the cook left, leaving me completely alone in the building. Whoever was out there wasn't just wandering by in the dark. They knew my schedule. They knew exactly when I was alone. Have you ever felt like someone was waiting for you in the dark? Story 7. This happened while I was house-sitting for my aunt and had to drive to an old rest area down the highway. The creaking floors didn't bother me until they started following me. My name is Everett Sloan. It was late November, and my aunt had asked me to look after her property in the rural countryside while she traveled overseas. I had agreed, thinking it would be a quiet week away from the city. But on my second night there, a pipe burst in the main bathroom. I had to shut off the water to the entire house to keep it from flooding. By the time I finished cleaning up the mess, it was past 2:30 a.m., and I really needed to use a restroom. Since there was no working plumbing in the house, I grabbed my car keys. I knew there was an old highway rest stop about 5 miles down the road. The highway was entirely empty. There were no streetlights out there, no other cars, just thick woods crowding the shoulder of the road. It was just me and my headlights cutting through the blackness. After about 10 minutes, I saw the faded blue sign for the rest area. I pulled onto the off-ramp. The place wasn't one of those bright, modern travel plazas. It was an older, rustic-looking building that resembled a large wooden cabin. The parking lot was completely deserted. No semi-trucks, no passenger cars. The single tall streetlight in the center of the lot flickered, casting long shadows across the pavement. I parked right by the entrance and turned off the engine. The silence outside was immediate. The wind blew through the tall pine trees, making a low, rushing sound. Something felt off. It was too isolated, but I really needed to go, so I stepped out into the freezing air and hurried toward the front doors. The inside of the building was mostly old brick and dark wood paneling. It smelled like strong pine cleaner mixed with damp, aging wood. The lobby was small, holding only a couple of dusty vending machines that hummed quietly in the corner. A narrow hallway led back to the restrooms. The floor in the hallway was made of thick, old wooden planks. Every step I took caused a loud, echoing creak that seemed to bounce off the brick walls. I pushed open the heavy wooden door to the men's room. It had a row of sinks along the left wall and 4 stalls lined up along the right. The overhead fluorescent lights buzzed with a constant, annoying electric hum. One of the lights near the back was burnt out, leaving the furthest stall covered in heavy shadows. The wooden floor planks actually continued into the bathroom itself. I walked past the urinals and headed for the second stall. I went inside, locked the metal latch, and sat down. For a minute or two, everything felt normal. It was just me, the buzzing lights, and the dead silence of the remote rest area. I pulled out my phone to pass the time. That was when I noticed the small detail. Underneath the metal partition of the stall to my right, stall number 3, I saw a pair of shoes. I paused. I had not heard anyone come into the bathroom. I hadn't heard the heavy wooden entrance door open. I hadn't heard the loud wooden floorboards in the hallway creak. I was completely alone when I walked in, but someone was standing in the stall right next to mine. I stared at the shoes. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe they had been in there before I even arrived, but as I kept looking at them, I realized something else, something that made my stomach drop. The shoes were facing the wrong direction. They were large, dark work boots, heavily scuffed and covered in dry mud, but the toes were pointing toward the back wall of the stall. They weren't positioned like someone sitting down, and they weren't facing the door to leave. The person was standing directly in front of the toilet, facing away from the door, just staring at the back wall. I didn't move. I expected the person to adjust their weight or make some kind of natural noise. In a public restroom, people make sounds, clothes rustle, feet shuffle, but the person in the stall next to me made absolutely zero sound. It was like they weren't even breathing. I felt uneasy. I tried to convince myself there was a normal explanation, maybe a sleepwalking driver. I just needed to finish up and get out. I tried to be quiet, slowly putting my phone away in my pocket. Then the pattern started. I heard a very subtle, distinct sound. Craig. It came from the floorboards in the stall right next to me. I looked down at the gap under the metal partition. The muddy black boots had moved. They had rotated 90 degrees. Now the toes of the boots were pointing directly at the metal divider. They were pointing directly at me. My heart started beating faster. The boots were just inches away from the partition. The person was standing right on the other side of the thin metal wall, facing my stall. And still, they didn't make a single sound. They were just standing there in perfect silence. I froze completely. I didn't want to blink. My mind was racing. How had they gotten inside without making the floorboards creak? I sat there in silence for what felt like hours. I kept my eyes locked on those dark boots. They didn't twitch. I decided I couldn't wait any longer. I slowly reached over for the toilet paper. The moment the paper made a faint rustling sound, it happened again. Craig. It was louder this time. The floorboards protested sharply. I looked down and the boots had moved once more. They had taken a step forward. They were now pressed directly against the bottom gap of the metal partition. The toes of the thick boots were almost crossing over the line into my stall. They knew exactly where I was. They were reacting to my sounds. I felt a sudden urge to run. I was completely isolated with a stranger who was acting entirely unnatural. There was no one around for miles. It was just me and whoever was standing on the other side of that divider. I finished up quietly. My hands were shaking. I stood up and adjusted my clothes. I didn't even bother to flush. I just wanted to get to my car. I reached out and slid the metal lock open. It made a loud, sharp click that echoed in the room. Instantly, I heard a heavier creak from the floor outside my stall. The boots had backed away from the partition. I watched the dark shadows of the feet move under the door. The person had stepped out of their stall and walked over. Now they were standing directly in front of my stall door. The toes of the muddy black boots were pointed right at the gap under my door. They were blocking my exit. I stood inside my stall, staring at the boots. I waited for them to say something or start banging on the door, but they did nothing. They just stood there perfectly still. I was terrified to open the door, but I knew I couldn't stay trapped in there. I slowly bent down, hoping to catch a glimpse of their hands through the gap, but the angle was wrong. All I could see were those dry mudded boots. As I crouched there, I noticed the smell in the bathroom had changed. The sharp smell of pine cleaner was completely gone. It was replaced by a strange, foul odor. It smelled like stagnant water, like a swamp. I had to make a move. I grabbed the door handle, bracing my legs. I decided I was going to shove the door open as hard as I could, push past whoever was standing there, and sprint straight for the front doors. I took a deep, shaky breath. I pushed the heavy metal door open with all my strength. The door swung open, hitting the opposite partition with a loud crash. I stepped out quickly, keeping my hands up. But the space in front of my stall was entirely empty. I stood in the middle of the bathroom, completely confused. I looked to my right. Stall number 3, where the person had been standing, had its door swung wide open. It was completely empty. There was absolutely no one in the bathroom with me. The entrance door hadn't made a sound. The floorboards in the hallway hadn't creaked. I quickly looked under the doors of the other 2 stalls. Nothing. The room was vacant. My heart was pounding against my ribs. I walked slowly toward the 3rd stall. I looked inside. The toilet was empty, but as I looked down at the wooden floor, something caught my eye. Right where the muddy black boots had been standing in the stall, and right where they had stood in front of my door, the floorboards were soaking wet. There was a large puddle of murky, dark water, shaped almost perfectly like 2 footprints. The water was fresh. It was slowly dripping down through the cracks in the old wood. I didn't try to figure it out. Every instinct I had told me to leave. I turned and sprinted out of the bathroom. I ran down the hallway, the floorboards creaking violently under my feet, the sound echoing loudly in the empty building. I burst out of the front doors into the freezing wind, ran to my car, and locked the doors. I drove straight back to my aunt's house and sat in my locked car in her driveway until the sun came up. I still don't know what was in that bathroom with me. I saw the boots move. I heard the floorboards creaking under their weight, but how could someone just vanish into thin air without making a single sound? Have you ever been completely alone in a room, but felt absolutely certain that someone was standing right next to you? Story 8. I used to take early morning jogs during my first year living in my new neighborhood. One morning, I realized someone else had been jogging the exact same route as me for weeks. My name is Leela Brenner. About 2 years ago, I moved into a very quiet suburban area on the outskirts of the city. I work remotely from home, so getting out of the house and getting some fresh air at least once a day is really important for me. I have always preferred to get my exercise done before the rest of the world wakes up. I like the peace and quiet. Usually I'm out the front door by 4:30 a.m. at the latest. At that time of day, it is completely dark outside. The streets are entirely empty, the houses are dark, and the only sound you can hear is the breeze in the trees and the rhythm of my own running shoes hitting the pavement. My neighborhood is basically a large grid of residential streets with a small community park sitting right in the middle of it. When I first started running there, my standard route was a very simple 3-mile loop. I would start by going down my street, take a left at the main four-way intersection, follow the long road that borders the edge of the park, and then head back up a long, steady hill toward my house. I really liked the routine. It felt familiar and it felt safe. I almost never saw anyone else out that early, aside from the occasional garbage truck or someone warming up their car to leave for an early shift. That feeling of safety changed about 3 weeks into my new routine. It was a Tuesday morning. I was about halfway through my run, just passing the dark, empty park. The streetlights along that specific stretch of road are spaced pretty far apart, so there are long pockets of darkness between the pools of yellow light. As I approached the next functioning streetlight, I saw a figure coming toward me from the opposite direction. At first, I honestly didn't think much of it. It was just another person out for an early run. As we got closer to each other, I shifted a little closer to the grass to give them plenty of space on the road. As the person entered the light, I saw it was a man. He was wearing a faded gray hoodie with the hood pulled all the way up over his head and baggy, dark sweatpants. Even though it was nothing crazy, something about the way he was moving immediately caught my attention. It was incredibly stiff. Most people bend their arms and have a bit of a natural bounce when they jog. This guy kept his arms almost completely straight down at his sides. They were just slightly swinging back and forth. His legs moved in these short, rigid, unnatural strides. As he passed by me on the other side of the road, he didn't look up at all. He just stared straight ahead at the asphalt. In the quiet morning air, I heard his shoes hitting the pavement. It wasn't a normal running sound. It was a heavy, lazy drag. Scuff stab, scuff stab. I watched him over my shoulder for a few seconds until he completely disappeared into the darkness behind me. I felt a little uneasy, but I brushed it off pretty quickly. People have weird running forms. It really wasn't a big deal. A few days went by and I didn't see him. I almost forgot about the whole thing. Then, on Friday, it happened again. I was at the exact same spot, right next to the park border. It was around 4:45 a.m. I saw a silhouette moving under the streetlights up ahead. I knew instantly it was him. As he got closer, I paid much more attention to his details. It was the exact same faded gray hoodie. I noticed this time that the left drawstring was completely missing from the hood, and there was a dark, circular stain near the front pocket. He was wearing the exact same dark sweatpants. Once again, his arms were hanging straight down. His posture was completely rigid. He jogged right past me on the other side of the street. Scuff stab, scuff stab. He didn't acknowledge me at all. His head was tilted slightly down, and the hood hid most of his face in heavy shadow. My stomach dropped a little bit this time. It was just a weird coincidence, I told myself. We just happened to be on the same schedule today. I finished my run, but I kept looking back over my shoulder the whole way home. I made sure to lock my door the second I got inside. The following week, the weather in the area shifted drastically. It had been crisp and cool all month, but a weird heat wave pushed through the state. At 4:30 a.m., it was already almost 80 degrees and extremely humid. The air felt heavy and gross. I stepped outside in just a thin tank top and running shorts, and I was already starting to sweat before I even began moving. Because of the intense heat, I decided to change my route. I didn't want to end my run with a long uphill climb, so I reversed my entire loop. I started by going down the hill and planned to loop around the far back of the neighborhood, completely avoiding the park area until the very end. I was about 2 miles in, jogging down Elm Street. This is a residential road I rarely ever take. It has almost no streetlights, just the dim glow from the porch lights of the houses. Up ahead in the dim light, a figure turned the corner and started jogging directly toward me. I immediately slowed my pace. My heart started beating a little faster in my chest. As the distance between us closed, I recognized the stiff, unnatural movement, the straight arms, the rigid, short strides. It was him, but that wasn't the part that made me stop dead in my tracks. It was almost 80 degrees outside, and he was wearing the exact same faded gray hoodie with the hood pulled up. He was wearing the same thick, dark sweatpants. I stared at the missing drawstring as he got closer. I looked at the dark stain on the pocket. Nobody runs in heavy winter clothes in the middle of a humid heat wave. He passed me, keeping the exact same distance as always. He didn't look at me. He didn't seem out of breath. He didn't even look like he was sweating at all. Scuff stab, scuff stab. Something felt completely off. My chest felt tight and my throat was dry. I didn't finish my run. I turned down the nearest side street and fast walked all the way home, constantly checking over my shoulder to see if he had turned around to follow me. He hadn't. I didn't run for the next 2 days. I just stayed inside my house, drinking my coffee and looking out the front window, waiting to see if he would jog past my property. I never saw him. By the 3rd day, I felt stupid. I was letting a weird neighbor ruin my morning routine. I decided I was going out, but I wasn't going to take any chances. I woke up at 3:45 a.m. instead of 4:30. I was going to take a completely random route. I would just take lefts and rights at random, never staying on one street for more than a few minutes. I left my house and started jogging. The neighborhood was dead silent. I took a sharp left off my street, then a right, then another left. I was zigzagging through the subdivisions, keeping my head on a swivel. Every single time I approached a corner, I expected to see him turn it, jogging straight toward me in that heavy hoodie, but nothing happened. After about 40 minutes of this random, chaotic route, I started to finally relax. The air was cool again. The familiar rhythm of my shoes on the asphalt was calming my nerves. I had completely thrown off the pattern. There was no way anyone could anticipate where I was going, because even I didn't know my own route. I found myself at the end of a long cul-de-sac called Willow Court. There was no way out except to turn around and go back the exact way I came. I reached the dead end, slowed to a complete stop to catch my breath, and put my hands on my knees for a second. The street was incredibly quiet. There was no wind, no cars, nothing. I stood up, turned around, and froze. He was right there. Not at the far end of the street, not turning the corner in the distance. He was maybe 20 feet away from me. And he wasn't jogging toward me from the opposite direction like he always did. He was facing me, but his body was positioned as if he had been running directly behind me this entire time. I hadn't heard anything. I hadn't heard the heavy drag of his shoes. I hadn't heard footsteps. I hadn't heard breathing, but he was right there. My stomach dropped completely. My legs felt like lead. He was jogging in place. No, that's not right. He was moving forward, but incredibly slowly. His arms were still hanging straight down. His legs were doing those rigid short strides. The hood was pulled low over his face. The missing drawstring swayed slightly with his movements. He was closing the distance between us, 15 feet. I couldn't speak. I wanted to yell, to ask him what his problem was, but my throat was completely tight. I couldn't move. 10 feet. I took a slow step backward. When I moved, his head slowly tilted up. For the first time, I looked under the hood. It was too dark to see any actual details, but I could tell I couldn't see a face at all. It was just dark shadow under the gray fabric. Scuff stab, scuff stab. The sound was back. It was so incredibly loud in the quiet street. I didn't think anymore. I just turned and sprinted. I didn't care about the dead end. I ran straight across the nearest residential lawn, pushing through some thick bushes that bordered the property line. Branches scraped my bare arms and my face, but I didn't stop for a single second. I scrambled over a low wooden fence, dropping heavily into someone's backyard. I kept running, cutting blindly through yards, climbing over whatever was in my way, until I finally hit a main street I recognized. I didn't stop sprinting until I reached my own front door. I unlocked it, bolted it from the inside, and backed away, staring at the handle, just waiting for it to slowly turn. It never did. I called the police later that morning. 2 officers came out to my house and took a report. I told them absolutely everything. I described the gray hoodie, the missing drawstring, the stiff running form, and the weird scuffing sound. They took down the information in a notepad, but I could tell by the bored look on their faces that they didn't think it was a big deal at all. They basically told me it was probably just a weird guy who also liked to run early, and that technically, no actual crime had been committed. They said they would send a patrol car through the neighborhood the next few mornings, just to be safe. That was the last I heard from them. I never ran in that neighborhood again. I ended up buying a treadmill a week later and put it in my closed garage. I know it sounds paranoid to some people, but I just couldn't bring myself to step out into that dark morning air anymore. About a month later, I was cleaning out my car. I went to throw away some trash in the bin beside my garage. It was late afternoon, broad daylight. The sun was shining. As I walked back up my driveway to go inside, I happened to look down at the pavement near the edge of my lawn. Lying there right where my driveway meets the street was a single, dirty gray drawstring. I haven't slept well since. Have you ever noticed someone showing up in your routine a little too often? Story 9. My roommate traveled a lot for work around the time I first noticed the elevator button. So when I heard him talking in his room at 3 a.m., I knew something was wrong. He wasn't home. My name is Marcus Hale. At the time this happened, I was living on the 8th floor of an older apartment building just outside the city. It was a decent place, mostly quiet, with a long, carpeted hallway that connected about 20 units. My roommate, Greg, was a medical equipment sales rep who spent 3 weeks out of every month driving across the state. I was taking mostly online classes at the time, which meant my schedule was entirely up to me. I liked the privacy. I usually stayed up late, playing video games or watching YouTube until early in the morning. The layout of our apartment was very simple. You walked through the front door into a small living room. My bedroom was on the right and Greg was on the left, right next to the front door. Because his wall was shared with the hallway, you could sometimes hear people walking by if they were talking loudly or dragging their feet. But at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday, the 8th floor was always dead silent. You could hear a pin drop out there. That's why hearing the voice was so strange. I had just turned off my computer and was getting ready for bed. The apartment was completely quiet. Then I heard it, a low, muffled voice coming from Greg's room. My stomach dropped. I stood frozen in the hallway just listening. It sounded like a man having a quiet, casual conversation. My first thought was that Greg had come home early and was on the phone, but I hadn't heard the front door open and I hadn't heard his keys jingling in the lock. I crept closer to his bedroom door. It was cracked open about an inch. I pushed the door open the rest of the way and flipped the light switch. The room was totally empty. His bed was made perfectly. His travel bags were gone. There was no one in there. But the voice hadn't stopped. It was just clearer now. It wasn't coming from inside the room. It was coming from right outside our front door, bleeding through the thin walls of the apartment. I felt uneasy. Who would be standing in the hallway at 3 a.m. just talking to themselves? I walked over to the front door and pressed my eye against the peephole. The hallway was brightly lit with fluorescent bulbs running down the center of the ceiling. There was no one standing outside my door. I adjusted my angle, looking as far down the hall as the lens would let me. At the very end of the corridor was the elevator. The elevator doors were sitting wide open. That was the first thing that struck me as odd. Usually the doors close automatically after 10 seconds, but they were just resting open, exposing the empty cab. I watched through the peephole for about a minute. The voice had completely stopped. Nobody walked out of the elevator. Nobody walked past it. Then slowly the heavy metal doors slid shut. The floor indicator above the frame lit up, showing it was heading back down. I backed away from the door and made sure the deadbolt was locked tight. I brushed it off as just a late-night neighbor doing something weird, maybe dealing with a phone call they didn't want their partner to hear. I went back to my room and eventually fell asleep. 2 nights later, it happened again. Greg was still out of town. It was around 2:30 a.m. this time. I was in the kitchen pouring a glass of water. The apartment was completely silent. Then I heard a heavy mechanical clunk from down the hall, followed by a familiar sound. Dang. It was the chime the elevator made when it arrived on a floor. It was loud enough that I could hear it clearly from my kitchen. I paused, holding my glass. I waited to hear the sound of footsteps on the hallway carpet. I waited to hear a key in a lock or an apartment door opening and closing, but there was nothing, just total silence. I set my glass down on the counter. Something felt off. I walked over to the front door and looked through the peephole again. Just like before, the elevator doors at the end of the hall were sitting wide open. The cab was completely empty. The bright light from inside the elevator spilled out onto the dark hallway carpet. I stood there staring at it. I didn't move a muscle. I just watched the empty space. I don't know why, but seeing the empty cab just sitting there made me incredibly anxious. It was as if it was waiting for someone. After about a full minute, the doors slid shut. The floor indicator went from 8 down to 7, then 6, and disappeared. Over the next week, this became a pattern. I started noticing it constantly. I'd be sitting on the couch watching a movie around 1 or 2 in the morning, and I'd hear the chime. Ding. I'd pause my TV and listen. The doors would open. They would sit open for 60 seconds. I started timing it. Then they would close. I started checking the peephole every time I heard it. Every single time the elevator was empty, but it kept coming to the 8th floor. I tried to think of a logical reason. Maybe there was a glitch in the system. Maybe the call button in the hallway was short-circuiting and bringing the car up on its own. It was an old building, so maintenance issues weren't exactly uncommon. I told myself I would bring it up to the landlord the next time I saw him. Then came Thursday night, the night that changed everything. It was a little after 1 a.m. I was completely out of groceries, and there was a 24-hour convenience store just a couple of blocks away. I grabbed my keys, slipped on my shoes, and walked out of my apartment. I locked the door behind me and turned to walk down the long, quiet corridor toward the elevator. I walked past Unit 814, then 816. The patterned carpet muffled my footsteps. As I got closer, I heard the mechanical hum of the elevator moving through the shaft. It was coming up. I watched the digital floor indicator above the elevator doors light up in red. 4, 5, 6, 7. Then it arrived at the 8th floor just as I walked up to it. I hadn't even pressed the call button on the wall yet. The metal doors slid open. The cab was completely empty. The harsh fluorescent lighting made my eyes hurt for a second. I stood there, hesitating in the hallway. I felt a tight knot forming in my stomach. I knew the elevator had been acting weird for a week, but having it open for me right as I walked up to it felt entirely different. It felt deliberate. I stepped inside the car. As soon as I did, I looked over at the button panel on the wall. My breath caught in my throat. The circular button for the 8th floor was glowing a bright, solid orange. In this building, the floor buttons inside the elevator only lit up when someone inside the cab actually pressed them. If someone called the elevator from the hallway, the button inside wouldn't light up at all. The only way the number 8 button could be glowing is if someone had gotten into this elevator on a lower floor, manually pressed 8, and rode it all the way up. But there was nobody in the elevator with me. I stared at the glowing orange circle. My mind went completely blank. I slowly reached my hand out toward the panel to press the button for the lobby. Before my finger could even touch the metal panel, the doors slammed shut. They didn't close at their normal, sluggish pace. They forcefully snapped together with a loud bang. I jumped back startled. I quickly jammed my finger into the L button. Nothing happened. The button didn't light up. I pressed it again, harder this time. Still nothing. I reached for the door open button and pressed it repeatedly. The elevator jerked abruptly. I had to grab the handrail to steady myself. The digital display above the door changed from 8 to 7. We were moving down. I hadn't pressed anything that worked. The 8th floor button was still the only one glowing orange. I watched the numbers count down, 6, 5, 4. I kept pressing the lobby button, but the elevator was completely ignoring my inputs. 3, 2, 1. I expected it to stop at the lobby. I took a step back toward the center of the cab, ready to sprint out the front doors the second they opened. But it didn't stop. The number 1 flashed on the screen, and then it changed to a B for the basement level. The basement of my building wasn't a standard parking garage. It was a sprawling, unfinished concrete storage area that mostly held old maintenance equipment, rusted pipes, and discarded furniture from previous tenants. The lighting down there was terrible, and residents were explicitly told not to go down there unless they absolutely had to. I had only been down there once to retrieve a package that was accidentally dropped near the boiler room. The elevator jerked to a halt. The mechanical humming stopped. The cab sat there in complete silence for a few seconds. The glowing orange light around the number 8 button finally flickered and turned off. Then, the heavy metal doors slowly slid open. I held my breath. The basement was pitch black. Only a few of the emergency lights were working, casting long, warped shadows across the cracked concrete floor. The air down there was freezing cold and smelled intensely like damp soil and mildew. I didn't step out. I stayed pressed against the back wall of the elevator. I stared out into the dark, unfinished basement, straining my eyes to see anything in the gloom. That's when I heard it again. It was the exact same low, muffled murmuring voice that I had heard coming from outside my apartment door nights ago. It was echoing from somewhere deep within the dark basement. It sounded like a man having a quiet, casual conversation with someone who wasn't there. The voice was coming closer. I panicked. I lunged at the control panel and started mashing the door close button with both hands. I hit the button for the 8th floor, the lobby, the 2nd floor, any button I could reach. The voice grew slightly louder. I could hear the faint sound of heavy footsteps dragging across the concrete. Someone was out there in the dark, and they were walking directly toward the open elevator doors. I pounded my fist against the metal panel. Finally, the doors began to slide shut. I watched through the narrowing gap as a figure stepped into the dim pool of light just a few feet away from the elevator. It looked like a tall man wearing a heavy, dark coat. I only saw his silhouette for a fraction of a second before the doors closed completely, locking him out. The elevator immediately jolted and began its ascent. I leaned back against the wall, my heart hammering against my ribs. I rode it all the way up to the 8th floor, sprinted out of the cab, ran down the hall, and locked myself securely inside my apartment. I sat on my couch with all the lights on until the sun came up. I never heard the elevator chime again that night. I moved out of that apartment complex at the end of the month. I never told my landlord, and I never told Greg about what happened. I just wanted to leave it behind me, but I still think about that night constantly. I think about the glowing button. I think about the voice in the hallway. Most of all, I think about what was waiting for me down in the basement. I never found out who or what was calling the elevator up to the 8th floor, and I never found out why it wanted me to come down. Has anyone else ever had an elevator do this? Story 10. One morning during the time I was renting a small storage unit outside town, I found a hidden folder on my laptop. When I opened it, the pictures inside showed me sleeping every single night. My name is Jordan Pike. To explain how I ended up finding those photos, I have to go back to when this whole thing started. About 8 months ago, I had to move out of my spacious 2-bedroom apartment and downsize to a much smaller studio closer to my new job. Because of the lack of space, I had a lot of things I just couldn't keep with me. I boxed up heavy winter clothes, old books, spare furniture, and random electronics, including an old silver laptop I hadn't used in a few years. I didn't want to pay a lot of money for a high-end, climate-controlled facility, so I searched online and found a cheap place on the outskirts of town. It was called Westside Self-Storage. It was an older outdoor facility consisting of long cinder-block buildings with bright orange roll-up metal doors. There was no security gate to scan into, no keypad, and no front office. You just booked a unit online and they emailed you your unit number. You had to provide your own padlock. I bought a heavy-duty combination lock from the hardware store. It was solid brass, the kind with 4 metal dials at the bottom. My assigned unit was number 42, located down a narrow gravel aisle near the very back of the property. The first weekend, I drove back and forth in my small car, unloading cardboard boxes, a few plastic tote bins, and a spare mattress. It was exhausting work. By the time I locked the orange door on Sunday evening, my back was aching, and I was just glad to be done with it. For the first 3 weeks, everything was completely normal. I didn't have any reason to go back. But late one Tuesday evening, I realized I needed a specific tax document that I had packed away in one of the banker boxes. It was around 8:30 p.m. when I pulled into the storage facility. The gravel crunched loudly under my tires as I drove down the dimly lit aisle. The place was totally deserted. A few flickering yellow street lamps provided the only light in the entire lot. I parked my car in front of Unit 42 and walked up to the door. That was when I noticed the first small thing. I have a very specific, stubborn habit. Whenever I use a combination lock, I always spin all 4 dials down to 0 after locking it. It's just something I've always done since high school. But when I reached for the lock that night, the dials were resting on random numbers: an 8, a 2, a 5, and a 9. I stood there with my hand on the cold brass lock, staring at the numbers. I felt a little confused. I tried to remember if I was in a massive rush the last time I was here. I told myself I must have just scrambled the numbers without thinking because I was tired from moving. I put in my combination, popped the lock open, and pulled the heavy metal door up. It rattled loudly in its metal tracks, the noise echoing sharply across the empty lot. I reached up and pulled the short string hanging from the single bare bulb in the ceiling. The harsh white light illuminated my things. Everything looked exactly how I left it. I stepped inside, found the tax document right where I left it in a cardboard box, closed it back up, turned off the light, and pulled the door down. I slid the latch over and locked it, making absolutely sure to spin all the dials back to 0000 before getting in my car and driving home. About a week and a half passed. The weather started getting noticeably colder, so I needed to go back to grab my heavy winter coats, which I had folded up in a large blue plastic tote bin. It was a Saturday night, maybe around 9:15 p.m. again. The facility was completely empty. It was so quiet you could hear the faint, distant hum of the highway a few miles away. I walked up to the orange door. I looked down at the padlock. The numbers were scrambled again. I felt uneasy. I knew for an absolute fact that I had zeroed them out last time. I vividly remembered standing there doing it. Someone had been messing with my lock. They had probably been twisting the dials, trying to guess the combination to get inside. I put in the code and pulled the heavy door up. I turned on the overhead light. At first glance, the unit looked fine, but as I stepped inside, something felt off. My large blue plastic tote bin, the one holding my winter coats, was no longer pushed flat against the cinderblock wall. It was pulled out maybe 6 or 7 inches, and it was rotated slightly on an angle. I walked over to it. One side of the plastic lid was popped open, not snapped down tightly like it should have been. My stomach dropped. I carefully lifted the lid, fully expecting my expensive coats to be gone, but they were still there. Nothing seemed to be missing at all. I spent 10 minutes just standing in the unit, opening boxes, lifting lids, trying to find anything out of place. I checked a box with some old video game consoles, still there. I tried to make sense of it. Why would someone try to break in, manage to get inside, not steal a single thing, but just move a plastic bin? It didn't make any logical sense. I looked up at the ceiling. The dividing walls of the unit were made of thin corrugated metal, but they didn't go all the way up to the actual roof of the building. There was about a foot of open space between the top of the wall and the ceiling to allow for airflow, stretching across all the units in the row. Chicken wire was stapled roughly across the gap, but it looked incredibly flimsy and old. I realized that if someone managed to get into an empty unit a few doors down, they could easily pull down the wire, crawl over the walls, and drop into the other locked units. I grabbed my coats, shoved them in a trash bag, pushed the blue bin back against the wall, and left. I locked the door and aggressively yanked on the padlock a few times to make sure it was secure. I spun the numbers firmly to 0 again. I tried to tell myself I was just being paranoid. Maybe the bin shifted when I pulled the heavy roll-up door down. I tried to believe that, but the feeling of unease wouldn't go away. A few days later, I couldn't stop thinking about the storage unit. It was bothering me. I decided I wanted to bring my old silver laptop back to my apartment. I had some old family photos on the hard drive I wanted to back up, and I frankly just wanted fewer things sitting vulnerable in that unit. It was a Thursday evening. Around 10 p.m. I drove back to Westside Self-Storage. The gravel path seemed much darker than usual. One of the overhead yellow street lamps was completely burnt out, leaving my section of the long building in deep, heavy shadows. I walked up to Unit 42, pulling my phone out to use as a flashlight. I shined it on the padlock. The dials were untouched. They were all resting perfectly on 0. I breathed a sigh of relief. See, I told myself, nothing to worry about, just my imagination working overtime. I put in the code, popped the heavy lock, and threw the door up. I walked in and pulled the light string. The moment the bulb flickered on, my breath hitched in my throat. The stack of 3 cardboard boxes I had neatly piled in the very center of the unit was completely dismantled. The boxes were now placed side by side on the dirty concrete floor, and sitting right in the middle of one of them was my old silver laptop. It wasn't in its black carrying case anymore. The empty case was tossed casually on the floor next to the boxes. The laptop was sitting out in the open, the lid closed but completely unburied from the heavy blankets I had packed it under. Someone had been inside. There was no denying it anymore. The logical excuses completely fell apart. Someone had physically moved my boxes, dug out my laptop, unzipped the case, and placed it right in the center of the room. It felt deliberate. I felt a cold sweat form on the back of my neck. I stood completely still, listening. The unit was dead silent. I looked around the small space. In the back corner, I had stacked my spare mattress and box spring vertically against the wall. They cast a dark, heavy shadow in the back of the room. I looked closely at the metal dividing wall separating my unit from the one next to it. Near the top, close to the chicken wire, the thick layer of dust was wiped away. It was smudged, like someone had grabbed the top of the wall with their bare hands and pulled themselves over. I didn't want to investigate any further. I just wanted to leave immediately. I grabbed the silver laptop, shoved it awkwardly under my arm, and reached for the light string. I pulled it, plunging the unit back into darkness. I stepped out into the freezing night air and grabbed the handle of the metal door. I pulled it down as fast as I could. It slammed against the concrete with a loud, metallic crash. I slid the metal latch over, pushed the padlock through the hole, and clicked it shut. I spun the numbers wildly, my hands shaking. I stood there for a second, catching my breath in the cold air, holding my laptop tightly against my side. And that's when I heard it. Right in front of me, on the exact other side of the thin orange metal door. A sound from inside my locked storage unit. It was a slow, distinct scraping noise, like a heavy cardboard box being dragged an inch or two across the dusty concrete floor. I froze, I completely stopped breathing. My hand was still hovering near the padlock. The silence that followed was suffocating. I strained my ears, hoping to God it was just the wind rattling the metal roof. Then I heard a footstep, a clear, heavy, deliberate footstep stepping down onto the concrete inside my unit. Someone was in there. Someone had been standing in there the entire time I was packing up my laptop. They had been hiding right behind the vertical mattresses in the back corner in the shadows, just feet away from me, watching me in the dead silence. I didn't yell, I didn't ask who was there. I just backed away slowly, my eyes completely locked on the orange door. My car was about 20 feet away. I turned, practically running, and got inside. I locked the doors, started the engine, and sped out of the gravel lot, kicking up dust behind me. I drove straight home, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles were white. I didn't call the police that night. It sounds stupid now, but I didn't know what to say. I didn't actually see anyone, and nothing was technically stolen. The next day, I brought 2 of my friends with me. We cut the lock off because I was too shaken up to even mess with the combination. We pulled the door up in the safety of broad daylight. The unit was a mess, things were torn apart, but what really made my stomach turn was what we found when we pulled the mattresses away from the back wall. Tucked tightly in the corner was a makeshift bed made from some of my old winter blankets. There were empty food wrappers scattered on the floor, a few empty water bottles, and a cheap plastic flashlight. Someone had been living in Unit 42. They had been climbing over the chicken wire from an adjacent empty unit, sleeping on my blankets and going through my life. We packed everything I owned into a rented truck in less than an hour and left. I never went back to Westside Self-Storage. I brought all my belongings back to my apartment, stacking the boxes in my small living room. I set the silver laptop on my kitchen counter. That night I locked every door and window in my apartment. I felt completely violated, but I also felt a deep sense of relief. It was finally over. I had all my things, and I was safe in my own home. Which brings me back to the beginning. The next morning I sat at my kitchen counter, drinking coffee. I opened up the old silver laptop to make sure it still worked, and to see if the person had messed with any of my personal files while they were living in my unit. It booted up slowly. The desktop appeared, cluttered with old icons. But right in the center of the screen was a new folder. It didn't have a name, it was just a generic yellow folder icon. My hand shook slightly as I moved the mouse over it. I double-clicked. Inside were dozens of image files, all time-stamped. I clicked the first one. It was a picture of me, asleep in my bed in my new apartment. The room was dark, illuminated only by the faint glow of a street lamp coming through the blinds. I clicked the next one, me, asleep from a slightly different angle taken from the foot of the bed. I kept clicking over and over, pictures of me sleeping. Some were blurry, some were perfectly clear. The dates on the files went back weeks. They started shortly after I moved my things in, matching the exact timeline of when I had been visiting the storage unit. Whoever had been living in Unit 42 hadn't just been going through my things. They had somehow figured out where I lived. They had followed me home. And they had been coming into my apartment at night, using my own laptop to take pictures of me while I slept, and then taking the laptop back to the storage unit during the day to leave it hidden. I moved out of that apartment 2 days later, completely breaking my lease. I never found out who it was, and the police never caught anyone at the storage facility. If they were living in my storage unit the whole time, how did they get a key to my apartment? Story 11. I was working late one night and looking up at the bus stop schedule, and everything felt completely normal until I noticed something that didn't make sense. My name is Kara Dalloway. At the time, I was working at a 24-hour call center located on the industrial edge of the city. My shifts almost always dragged on until just before midnight. The walk from my office to the bus stop routed me through a commercial park that got completely deserted after dark. There were no houses or open stores around, just massive warehouses locked behind heavy chain-link fences. The bus stop itself was just a standard glass shelter on the sidewalk and a tall metal pole holding a digital transit schedule screen. I relied on that screen every single night. It was a Tuesday when the strange things started. I got to the stop around 11:45 p.m., feeling exhausted. I sat down on the cold metal bench and looked up at the digital display. Normally, seeing those bright orange LED letters gave me a huge sense of relief. It usually displayed Route 42, which was my bus home, along with the minutes counting down. But that night, the screen was acting up. It flickered a few times, giving off a quiet, static buzzing sound that I hadn't noticed before. It showed Route 42 arriving in 3 minutes. I kept my eyes on it, just waiting for the time to pass. Then, the number abruptly jumped. It went from 3 minutes directly to the word due. I stood up and walked to the curb. I looked down the long, straight avenue. It is a very wide road, so you can easily see headlights coming from over a mile away. But the street was completely dark. There were no cars, no delivery trucks, and definitely no city bus approaching. I looked back up. The sign was still flashing due. I assumed the transit system was just lagging. About 5 minutes later, the screen went completely blank, reset itself, and then correctly showed my bus arriving in 10 minutes. When my actual bus showed up, everything was perfectly normal. I brushed the whole thing off as a simple software error. Thursday night was when things started feeling more off. It was raining a freezing drizzle. I walked as fast as I could and rushed into the glass shelter. Someone had left a crushed, faded blue soda can sitting on the corner of the metal bench. I stared at it for a second before looking up at the digital screen. The screen was glitching again. The buzzing sound from the hardware was a lot louder this time. The display read Route 42, but the minutes were jumping rapidly. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 2 minutes. It was cycling through numbers that didn't make any sense. Then the screen cleared completely. When the bright orange letters popped back up, my stomach dropped just a little bit. It didn't say Route 42 anymore. It said Route 99. I use the transit system every single day. I know all the routes on this side of town. There is absolutely no Route 99. I quickly pulled out my phone and opened the city transit app. It didn't show any Route 99 on the map. It just showed my regular bus running 15 minutes late. But the sign above me kept flashing. Route 99 2 min. I told myself it had to be a system error. Maybe someone in the control room was running a test, or it was just a severe glitch in the aging software. Still, sitting out there completely alone in the freezing rain, watching that sign count down for a ghost bus, I felt uneasy. Route 99 1 min. I found myself staring down the dark, wet street again. The timer eventually hit due. The street remained totally empty. After a minute or so, the sign flickered and went back to normal, showing my actual bus. When I finally got back to my apartment that night, I made sure my deadbolt was locked tight. The very next night was Friday. My manager had asked me to stay late to cover the phones. By the time I finally clocked out, it was almost 1:30 a.m. The industrial park was dead quiet. It was the kind of heavy quiet that makes your own footsteps sound way too loud against the concrete. I walked to the bus stop. The temperature had dropped and I could clearly see my breath in the cold air. When I got to the glass shelter, I noticed the exact same crushed blue soda can was still sitting on the edge of the bench, right where it had been the night before. I sat down, keeping my distance from it, and looked up at the pole. The screen was completely black. There was no buzzing sound tonight, just dead silence. I checked my phone to see when the bus was coming. My battery was only at 4%, which instantly made me feel more anxious. The transit app finally loaded, showing that the last Route 42 bus of the night was 25 minutes away. 25 minutes is a very long time to sit alone on an empty street at nearly 2 a.m. I put my phone back in my pocket to save the battery and leaned back against the cold glass of the shelter. About 10 silent minutes passed, then I heard it, that familiar, quiet buzzing sound. The black screen suddenly lit up with bright orange text. Route 99 5 min. Something felt really off this time. It wasn't just seeing that weird route number again. It was the unsettling fact that the screen had been completely dead until I had been sitting there in the dark for 10 minutes. It felt almost like it had been waiting for me. I stood up and started packing around the shelter. Route 99 4 min. The buzzing sound seemed to echo slightly down the empty street. I looked around at the dark warehouses. All their heavy metal gates were pulled down tight. There were no cars parked anywhere. It was just me. Route 99 3 min. I checked my phone, desperately hoping the time would pass faster, but the screen stayed completely black. It had died. I was completely cut off. All I had was the glowing orange sign directly above me. Route 99 2 min. I started looking down the avenue again. The streetlights illuminated small patches of the gray asphalt. I strained my eyes, trying to see if anything was moving out there. My heart started beating a little faster. I kept repeating to myself that it was just a glitch, just a stupid computer error. Route 99 1 min. I stopped packing. The The silence on the street felt heavy and oppressive. I kept my eyes fixed on the distant, dark end of the road, unable to look away. Then the sign flashed, Route 99 due. I let out a slow, shaky breath, fully expecting the street to stay empty just like it had the previous nights. But this time, far down the avenue, a pair of headlights slowly turned the corner. My stomach dropped, I froze in place. I watched as the headlights got closer and closer. The heavy rumble of a diesel engine finally broke the silence. It was definitely a city bus. As it approached, I could see the standard city transit colors. It looked completely normal. It slowed down as it neared my stop. The air brakes hissed loudly in the cold night air, making me flinch. The bus pulled right up to the curb, stopping exactly in front of the glass shelter. I stepped forward slowly. Even though the route number didn't exist, I just wanted to get out of the freezing cold. I stood by the front doors, waiting for them to hiss open. But they didn't. I stood there on the curb, the engine idled with a deep, vibrating hum. I looked up at the digital sign above the bus windshield. It was completely blank. I stepped closer and looked through the glass door. The interior lights were on, but they were incredibly dim, casting a pale yellow glow over the empty seats. There wasn't a single passenger inside. I knocked on the glass, thinking the driver hadn't seen me. The doors stayed shut. I leaned forward and cupped my hands around my eyes to peer directly into the driver's area. There was no one in the driver's seat. The steering wheel was completely bare. The seat was empty. There was no one operating the vehicle, yet the engine was still running, idling perfectly. I took a fast step backward. A massive city bus doesn't just drive itself through the streets and stop perfectly at a designated shelter. Suddenly the engine revved loudly. The air brakes released. The bus slowly pulled away from the curb. I watched as it moved steadily down the street, keeping perfectly within its lane until its red taillights disappeared into the dark. A gust of freezing wind swept through the shelter. The crushed blue soda can rattled off the bench and hit the pavement. I looked back up at the pole. The screen was still glowing brightly. Route 99 due. It never cleared, it just stayed frozen like that until my actual bus arrived 20 minutes later. I ran on and never looked back. Have you ever seen something late at night that completely defied logic? Story 12. When I first arrived at that generic business hotel off the interstate, I didn't think anything of it, but looking back, that was my first mistake. My name is Grant. I travel a lot for my job in regional sales, which means I spend roughly 2 weeks out of every month sleeping in standard, identical hotel rooms. You know the exact type of place I'm talking about. They have faded pattern carpets, heavy blackout curtains, and a mini fridge in the corner that hums a little too loud. It was a Tuesday evening in late October, and I had just driven 4 hours to get to this specific town for a morning meeting. I checked in at the front desk around 8 p.m., got my keycard, and dragged my duffel bag up to room 314 on the 3rd floor. The room was exactly what you would expect. It had a king-sized bed, a small desk against the wall, and a narrow entryway that passed right by the bathroom door. I dropped my bag on the luggage rack, kicked off my shoes, and immediately turned on the TV just to have some background noise. It was too late to go out and find a restaurant, so I ordered some food on an app and sat at the small desk to review my notes for the next day. Everything was completely normal at first. I ate my food, answered a few emails on my laptop, and watched whatever movie was playing on the basic cable channels. The hotel itself was surprisingly quiet. Usually in these cheaper places, you hear heavy doors slamming down the hall or people talking through the thin walls, but that night it was just dead silent. Around 11:30 p.m., I decided to call it a night. I shut down my laptop, turned off the main overhead room lights, and walked into the bathroom to get ready for bed. The bathroom was small and very brightly lit, with one of those massive, wall-to-wall mirrors glued right above the sink counter. The bathroom door was wide open behind me. Because of the angle when I stood at the sink, the mirror perfectly reflected the open doorway, giving me a clear view of the dark hotel room and the foot of my bed in the background. I turned on the faucet, grabbed my toothbrush, and splashed some cold water on my face. I was looking down at the drain, scrubbing my teeth, just zoning out. When I briefly glanced up at my own reflection in the mirror, something caught my eye. In the background of the reflection, right in the open doorway behind me, a dark shape moved quickly from right to left. It looked exactly like a person walking swiftly past the bathroom door, heading toward the main entrance of the hotel room. I froze. I kept my eyes locked on the mirror for a few seconds, the electric toothbrush still vibrating in my hand. My stomach dropped. I turned around fast, fully expecting to see someone standing in the dark room. There was no one. I stepped out of the bathroom, flipped the main room lights back on, and checked the entire space. I walked over and checked the lock on the front door. The deadbolt was thrown and the metal security latch was flipped over. Nobody had come in. I checked the small closet, looked behind the blackout curtains, and even crouched down to look under the bed. The room was completely empty. I stood there in the middle of the room, feeling my heart rate slowly go back down. I told myself I was just exhausted. Driving for 4 hours straight and staring at highway lines can mess with your vision. It was probably just a shadow from cars passing outside on the street, or maybe just my tired eyes playing tricks on me in the bright fluorescent light of the bathroom. I turned the main lights back off, finished brushing my teeth, keeping my eyes focused straight down on the sink this time, and got into bed. I kept the TV on a low volume and set the sleep timer for an hour. I tried to close my eyes, but I felt restless. You know that feeling when you just can't get comfortable in a strange bed? I kept tossing and turning, pulling the heavy hotel comforter up and then pushing it back down. Every time the AC unit kicked on, the sudden mechanical noise made me jump. I kept looking over at the open bathroom door. The light was off now, but the large mirror still caught the faint blue glow of the television screen. It just sat there, a dark, glossy rectangle on the wall. I eventually drifted off to sleep sometime around midnight. I woke up feeling incredibly thirsty. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand and the bright screen read 2:15 a.m. The TV had turned itself off, so the room was pitch black except for the small slivers of orange streetlights sneaking past the edges of the curtains. I sat up on the edge of the bed and rubbed my face. I walked over to the bathroom, reached blindly for the wall switch and flicked it on. The sudden bright light made me squint. I walked to the sink, grabbed one of the small plastic cups wrapped in plastic, and filled it with cold tap water. As I drank the water, I looked up at the mirror again. I wasn't deliberately trying to look for anything. It was just a natural habit. I was just staring at my own tired face. Then the reflection in the background changed again. This time it wasn't a quick blurry shadow. A person walked right past the open bathroom door in the reflection, but they didn't rush. They walked slowly, deliberately. It was just a tall, dark, solid silhouette moving from the side of the room where my bed was, heading toward the front door. The movement was incredibly smooth, almost gliding. I dropped the plastic cup into the sink. It made a loud clatter that echoed sharply in the small space. I spun around, my back hitting the hard edge of the sink counter. I stared out the bathroom door into the pitch-dark hotel room. Nothing, absolute silence. I didn't move for what felt like 10 minutes. My chest felt tight and my hands were actually shaking. Something felt very off. I could clearly see the area where the figure had just walked in the mirror, but the actual room right in front of me was completely empty and perfectly still. There was no shadow from outside that could explain that kind of slow, deliberate packing. Someone or something had just walked right past me. I refused to step back out into the dark room right away. I stayed in the brightly lit bathroom, breathing heavily. When I finally gathered enough courage, I practically sprinted to the nightstand, grabbed the TV remote, and turned the television back on. I turned on every single light switch I could find. The desk lamp, the floor lamp, the entryway light. I checked the front door again, still dead-bolted, still latched tight. I knew I wasn't going to get any sleep if I had to keep looking at that mirror from my bed. I walked back into the bathroom, purposefully keeping my eyes fixed on the tile floor. I grabbed one of the large, thick white bath towels from the metal rack. I reached up and carefully draped the towel over the top edge of the large mirror, making sure it covered the glass completely. I tucked the corners firmly behind the wooden frame of the mirror so it wouldn't slip down. I made sure there were no gaps. I just wanted the reflection covered. I left the bathroom light on, left all the room lights on, and got back into bed. I sat propped up against the headboard with the TV playing some late-night infomercial on mute. I didn't sleep a single minute for the rest of the night. I just sat there, staring at the open bathroom door, looking at the white towel hanging perfectly still over the mirror. Every time the building shifted or the ice machine hummed down the hall, I flinched. The hours dragged on in total silence. Finally, around 6:30 a.m., the sun started coming up. The daylight bled through the curtains, mixing with the artificial lights I had left on all night. With the morning came a false sense of security. I started to feel a little embarrassed about how terrified I had been just a few hours ago. I convinced myself again that my brain was just exhausted and projecting things in my peripheral vision from stress. I got out of bed, stretched my stiff back, and walked over to the bathroom to take a shower and get ready for my morning meeting. I stepped into the bathroom, pulling my t-shirt over my head. I looked up at the wall above the sink. The large mirror was completely bare. I stood there freezing in place. I slowly looked down at the counter. The white bath towel I had firmly tucked around the mirror frame the night before wasn't on the floor. It wasn't hanging loose. It was sitting right there on the edge of the granite sink counter, neatly folded into a perfect, tight square. Has anyone else ever experienced something like this in a hotel room? Story 13. It was around the time I started leaving my parked bike outside my apartment when I first started noticing something was off, and it only got worse from there. I'm Rowan Fletcher. I live by myself in a ground floor apartment in a pretty average older building. The setup of the complex is a bit open. My front door leads right onto a concrete walkway that connects to the main parking lot. Right next to my front door is my living room window, and bolted into the concrete directly beneath that window is a heavy, rusted metal bike rack. I don't own a car, so I rely on my bike for everything. I ride it to work, I ride it to get groceries, and every single evening I lock it up on that rack. Because the rack is literally 3 feet from my window, I never worried about anyone messing with it. Plus, I always use a thick steel U-lock through the main frame. It was just a normal part of my daily routine, right up until late September. It started on a Tuesday morning. I walked out my front door around 7:30 a.m. holding my coffee, ready to head to work. As I walked over to the rack, I noticed my bike wasn't exactly how I had left it the night before. I have a very specific habit of backing the bike into the rack so the front tire faces outward. It makes it faster to unlock and pull away in the mornings, but that morning it was different. It looked like someone had grabbed the handlebars and rolled it a few inches forward. The front wheel was turned sharply to the left, wedged awkwardly against the metal bars of the rack. The pedals were also in a different position than where I usually leave them. I stood there looking at it for a second, feeling a little confused. I figured some guy walking through the complex late at night probably just stumbled into it in the dark, or maybe a neighbor bumped it while carrying something past my window. I shrugged it off, unlocked it, and went to work. I didn't think much of it. But the next day it happened again, and this time it was impossible to ignore. I came out on Wednesday morning and my bike was facing the opposite direction entirely. I stopped dead in my tracks. It was completely turned around, with the front tire pointing toward the brick wall of my apartment building. I felt uneasy. I quickly checked the lock. The heavy steel U-lock was still perfectly secured around the frame and the metal rack. Nothing was cut or broken, but whoever had done this had to physically lift the heavy back end of the bike and forcibly pivot it around the metal pole. That isn't something that happens by accident. You don't just bump into a locked bicycle and spin it 180 degrees. It takes deliberate effort. I stood there on the empty sidewalk, looking around the parking lot. It was quiet. It felt like someone might be watching me from one of the other windows, waiting to see my reaction. That night I started locking it tighter. I pulled the bike as close to the center pole of the rack as physically possible. I put the U-lock through the frame and the rear wheel, and then I added a thick steel cable lock, wrapping it through the front tire and securing it to the base of the rack. The bike was essentially fused to the concrete. It couldn't be pivoted or rolled at all. I went to bed feeling a lot better. It didn't stop. For the next week and a half, my bike kept changing position overnight. I would wake up, walk outside, and find it tampered with. Because I had locked it so tightly, whoever was doing it couldn't turn the whole bike anymore. So they started messing with whatever parts they could reach. One morning, the rubber grips on the handlebars had been forcefully twisted completely backward. Another morning, the seat was dropped all the way down to the lowest setting. Sometimes it was just violently leaning away from the rack, putting massive strain on the steel locks, like someone had tried to rip it out of the concrete with their bare hands. It was incredibly frustrating, but mostly it was starting to scare me. It didn't make any sense. Why would someone keep returning to my window night after night just to mess with my bike without actually trying to steal it? It felt like some kind of game. By the second week, I decided I needed to figure out who was doing it. My bed is positioned right against the front wall of my apartment, just a few feet away from the window and the bike rack outside. On a Thursday night, I turned off all the lights in my apartment and left my window cracked open about 2 inches. I laid in bed in the dark, wide awake, just listening. Around 2:30 a.m., the silence broke. I didn't hear footsteps or voices. I heard a sound I recognized immediately. It was the heavy, distinct scraping sound of thick rubber tires dragging against concrete. My stomach dropped. I slowly pushed my blankets off and crept out of bed. The floorboards in my apartment creaked badly, so I had to step as lightly as possible. I moved over to the window, keeping my body pressed flat against the wall so whoever was outside wouldn't see my outline. I carefully reached up and parted 2 of the plastic blinds with my fingers, just enough to peek out. The streetlights in the parking lot were casting a dull orange glow over the sidewalk. Standing directly under my window, right next to my bike, was a person. It was a man. He was tall, dressed in dark jeans and a heavy black hooded jacket. The hood was pulled up tightly, hiding his head completely. His back was facing me. He wasn't holding bolt cutters or tools. He had both hands firmly gripped on my handlebars, and he was violently yanking the bike back and forth, trying to tear it away from the rack. The steel locks clanked heavily against the metal pole. I didn't know what to do. Should I bang on the glass, yell at him? Before I could move, he stopped. He let go of the handlebars and stood perfectly still. Then, very slowly, he turned his head over his shoulder and looked directly at my window. Because of the dark hood and the shadows, I couldn't see his face at all, but I knew exactly where he was looking. He was looking directly at the tiny gap in the blinds where I was standing. I froze. I didn't drop the blinds. I just stood completely motionless in the dark apartment, hoping he couldn't see my eyes looking back at him. He stayed like that for a full minute, just staring dead ahead at the glass. Then he slowly turned around, put his hands in his pockets, and calmly walked away down the dark sidewalk. I didn't sleep a single minute the rest of that night. I just sat on the edge of my bed, waiting for him to come back. The next day I had enough. After work I went to a hardware store and bought the thickest, heaviest motorcycle chain lock they sold. When I got home, I chained the bike to the rack so tightly that it couldn't move a single inch in any direction. I locked the deadbolt on my front door, latched the chain, and finally felt somewhat secure. For the next few days nothing happened. The weekend passed quietly. I didn't hear any scraping sounds outside. I didn't see anyone near my window. I figured the massive chain lock had finally sent the message, and the guy had moved on. It was Tuesday night. I was exhausted and went to bed early. The apartment was completely silent. Sometime deep in the middle of the night, I woke up. I didn't know what woke me at first. I just laid there in the dark, blinking at the ceiling. The green numbers on my alarm clock read 3:15 a.m. I started to close my eyes again when I heard a sound. It wasn't a scrape outside my window. It was a heavy, dull thud, and it came from right outside my front door. I laid perfectly still, listening. 10 seconds passed, then another sound, a quiet, heavy scraping noise against the exterior wood of my front door. It sounded like something very large was being dragged against it. Something felt terribly wrong. I quietly slipped out of bed, grabbing a heavy metal flashlight from my nightstand. I crept out of my bedroom and walked slowly down the short hallway into the dark living room, keeping my eyes fixed on the front door. The deadbolt was still locked, the chain was still secured, the apartment was completely quiet again. I gripped the flashlight tight, walked up to the door, and slowly pressed my eye against the peephole. I looked out onto the concrete walkway. I couldn't see anything. It was completely black. At first I thought the street light outside had burned out, but as I kept looking, I realized the darkness wasn't the night outside. Something was physically blocking the peephole. Something was pressed directly against the glass on the other side of my door. I backed away, my hands shaking slightly. I needed to know what was out there. I slowly reached out, turned the deadbolt as quietly as I could, and slid the chain off the latch. I gripped the door handle, took a deep breath, and pulled the door inward just a few inches. The second the door moved, a massive weight fell directly toward me. I jumped back with a gasp as a large, heavy object crashed violently onto the hardwood floor of my entryway, the loud metal sound echoing through the small apartment. I immediately clicked on my flashlight and aimed the beam down at the floor. It was my bike. I quickly shined the flashlight past the open doorway and looked over at the bike rack under my window. The rack was entirely empty. Lying on the concrete next to it were my thick steel U-lock and the heavy motorcycle chain. Both of them had been completely severed straight through the metal. I slowly looked back down at the heavy frame lying awkwardly on my floor. It wasn't leaning against the rack outside. Last time, it was leaning against my door instead of the rack. Whoever it was hadn't just cut the locks. They had carried my heavy bicycle over to my front door and deliberately propped it up against the wood, knowing I was inside sleeping just a few feet away. I slowly raised the flashlight beam, shining it out the open doorway and down the concrete walkway. Standing at the very edge of the parking lot, just beyond the reach of the flickering streetlight, was the tall figure in the dark hooded jacket. He wasn't moving. He was just standing there in the shadows, facing my apartment, watching my open door. He didn't run, he didn't say a single word. He just stood there for a few long seconds, completely still. Then he slowly turned around and walked away into the dark, leaving me standing alone in my open doorway with my broken bike on the floor. I moved out of that apartment at the end of the month and never parked a bike outside again. Who do you think was messing with it? Story 14. I remember that night clearly because nothing unusual was supposed to happen at my new apartment, but it did. My name is Sadie. At the time, I was 24 years old and had just moved into my own place for the very first time. It was a small, ground-floor unit in a quiet residential neighborhood. I worked a regular office job, usually getting home around 6, making dinner, and spending the rest of the evening relaxing. There wasn't anything remarkable about the building or the area. The only annoying thing about the apartment was the street lamp right outside my bedroom window. It had a faulty bulb that let out a constant, low electrical buzzing sound. During the day you couldn't hear it, but at night, when everything was completely quiet, that buzzing was always there in the background. It was a Tuesday night when things started. I had gone to bed around 11 and was completely dead asleep. Suddenly my phone started vibrating on the wooden nightstand right next to my head. The sudden noise startled me awake. I rubbed my eyes, rolled over, and grabbed my phone. The bright light from the screen hurt my eyes, but I forced them open to look at the caller ID. The screen just said, "No caller ID." I checked the time at the top of the screen. It was exactly 2 a.m. I didn't usually answer unknown numbers, especially not in the middle of the night, but my groggy brain thought maybe it was an emergency. Maybe one of my parents was at the hospital and calling from a strange phone. I swiped to answer and brought the phone to my ear. "Hello," I said, my voice heavy with sleep. There was no answer. "Hello, who is this?" I asked again, speaking a little louder. Still nothing. I listened closely, but there wasn't even background noise. It was just dead, empty silence. I pulled the phone away, looked at the screen to make sure the call was still connected, and then hung up. I set the phone face down on the nightstand and laid back down. I felt uneasy about it, but I eventually convinced myself it was just a wrong number or an automated spam call that got mixed up. It took me another hour to fall back asleep. The next day went by normally. By the time I got home from work, I had almost entirely forgotten about the weird call. That night, a Wednesday, I decided to stay up a little later. I was sitting on my couch in the living room, scrolling through my phone and watching TV. The apartment was quiet, except for the low volume of the television. Then my phone started ringing again. I looked at the screen, no caller ID. I glanced up at the clock on the wall. It was exactly 2 a.m. again. Something felt off. A wrong number at the exact same time 2 nights in a row didn't make sense. I stared at the screen as it kept vibrating in my hand. I thought about just letting it ring, but curiosity got the better of me. I answered it and held it to my ear, but I didn't say anything this time. I just listened. At first, there was the same empty silence as the night before, but after about 10 seconds, the silence broke. I heard a faint, scratchy static. It wasn't loud, and it didn't sound like television static. It sounded more like the rustling of a microphone rubbing against fabric, or maybe a bad cellular connection. It was just a rhythmic, faint crackling sound. "Who is this?" I asked firmly. The static stopped for a second and then started again. It was like whoever was on the other end was shifting around. "Stop calling this number," I said, and then I ended the call. I locked my phone and tossed it onto the couch cushion next to me. I walked over to the front door and double-checked the deadbolt just to be sure. I didn't sleep very well that night. By Thursday evening, I was genuinely anxious. I tried to look up how to block unknown callers on my phone, but my carrier's settings were confusing, and I couldn't figure out a way to block hidden numbers without blocking all incoming calls from people not in my contacts. I went to bed early, hoping to just sleep through the night, but I couldn't fall asleep. I just laid there in the dark, listening to the faint buzzing of the street lamp outside my window. I kept checking my phone, 1:30, 1:45, 1:55. When the time hit exactly 2 a.m., the screen lit up the dark bedroom. No caller ID. My heart started beating a little faster. I sat up in bed, my back resting against the headboard. I didn't want to answer it. I really didn't. But part of me felt like if I didn't answer, they would just keep calling or maybe leave a voicemail that would be even worse to listen to. I took a deep breath, tapped the green button, and brought the phone to my ear. I didn't say a word, I just waited. The static from the night before was gone. Instead, there was a new sound. It was breathing. It was soft, but it was incredibly clear. It sounded wet and heavy, like the person had the bottom of their phone pressed directly against their mouth. I could hear the slow inhale and the slightly shuddering exhale. I froze. I didn't say anything. I barely even breathed myself. The person on the other end just kept breathing. In and out, in and out. It was steady and deliberate. I wanted to hang up, but I was paralyzed by this overwhelming sense of wrongness. I needed to know if it was a recording, or if someone was actually sitting on the other end of the line, just holding the phone to their face in the dark. I slowly pulled the phone away from my ear. I looked at the bright screen, found the mute button, and tapped it. I brought the phone back to my ear. The breathing on the other end had stopped. There was total silence. My stomach dropped. They weren't just breathing, they had been listening to me. The moment I muted my end, cutting off the ambient noise of my bedroom, they noticed. They stopped breathing so they could listen harder, trying to figure out if I had hung up or if I was still there. It wasn't a prank dial, it was someone actively paying attention to my reactions. I hit the red button and ended the call. I threw the phone onto the floor and turned on the lamp next to my bed. I sat awake for the rest of the night with all the lights on, jumping at every minor creak the apartment building made. Friday was exhausting. I was running on zero sleep. I spent the entire day at work feeling paranoid, wondering if every stranger I passed on the street was the person who was calling me. When I got home that night, I made a decision. I wasn't going to answer anymore. If they called, I would just let it ring. I stayed in the living room. I made a cup of tea and tried to watch a movie, but I couldn't focus on the screen. My eyes kept darting back to my phone, sitting on the coffee table. Midnight passed, then 1 a.m. At exactly 2 a.m., the phone lit up and started vibrating against the wood table. No caller ID. I crossed my arms and just stared at it. I watched it ring until it finally stopped and went to voicemail. I waited for a voicemail notification to pop up, but nothing came. I felt a brief wave of relief. Maybe ignoring it was the right move. But less than a minute later, the phone started vibrating again. They were calling back. I got angry. The fear suddenly turned into frustration. I was tired of being scared in my own home by some creep with a blocked number. I grabbed the phone off the table and answered it. "Listen to me," I practically yelled into the receiver. "If you call this number one more time, I am going to the police. I mean it." I stopped and listened, waiting for a response, waiting for the breathing or the static. But I didn't hear breathing. Instead, I heard a very faint, low, electrical buzzing sound coming through the speaker. It was a constant, steady hum. I stood completely still in the middle of my living room. I turned my head toward the short hallway that led to my bedroom. The buzzing on the phone exactly matched the sound of the faulty street lamp outside my bedroom window. They weren't calling from their house. They were calling from right outside my apartment. I didn't hang up. I kept the phone pressed tightly to my ear and slowly, silently walked down the hallway into my dark bedroom. I didn't turn on the lights. I approached the window. The blinds were drawn shut, but there was a tiny gap between the slats near the edge of the frame. The buzzing sound coming through my phone speaker was perfectly synced with the actual buzzing coming through the glass. I leaned forward and put one eye right up to the gap in the blinds, looking out into the parking lot. Standing directly under the orange glow of the broken street lamp, just a few feet from my bedroom window, was a man. He was wearing a dark hooded sweatshirt pulled up over his head. His head was tilted down, illuminated by the pale blue light of the cell phone he was holding up to his ear. I watched him stand there perfectly still. Through my phone, I heard him take a slow, deep breath. I immediately ended the call and backed away from the window. I grabbed my keys, ran out the front door of my apartment, got into my car, and drove straight to my parents' house across town. I called the police the next morning. They sent an officer to take a report, but because there was no forced entry, no explicit verbal threats, and the number was completely blocked, there wasn't much they could actually do. They told me to keep my doors locked and to call back if I saw him again. I broke my lease 2 weeks later and moved back in with my parents until I could find a place on the other side of the city. I never saw the guy under the street lamp again. I changed my phone settings so that unknown numbers are completely silenced and sent straight to a full voicemail box. I haven't answered a single blocked call since that night. But when I check my recent call logs in the morning, I still see them. Every few days, right around 2 a.m., the blocked calls still come. Has anyone else ever dealt with a blocked caller who just listens? Story 15. At first, I thought it was just my imagination while I was at the local grocery store late one night, until it happened again. My name is Theo Markham, and for the last few years I've worked an afternoon shift that leaves me with a pretty messed up sleep schedule. Because of that, I've always preferred doing my grocery shopping very late, usually around 11 p.m. or even midnight. The aisles are completely empty, there are no long lines at the registers, and I can just get in, get my food, and get out without having to deal with a crowded store. The place I normally go to is a 24-hour supermarket just a few miles down the road from my apartment complex. It's a massive building, but at that hour it feels like a ghost town. It's usually just me, maybe one other random customer wandering the frozen section, and a tired cashier waiting for their shift to end. The first time it happened was on a Tuesday in late October. I had just grabbed my usual weekly stuff, a gallon of milk, a loaf of bread, some chicken breasts, and a few snacks to get me through the next few nights. I walked up to the single open register at the front of the store, paid for my things, and walked out into the empty parking lot. I have this habit of always glancing over my receipt while my car warms up, just to see how much I spent and make sure I wasn't overcharged for anything. The dome light of my car illuminated the small slip of paper. As I was looking down the printed list of groceries, one item right at the very bottom stood out to me. It said, canned peaches, $1.89. I didn't buy canned peaches. Honestly, I don't even like peaches, so I knew for a fact I hadn't accidentally tossed them into my cart without thinking. I felt a little confused, so I looked over at the plastic bags sitting in my passenger seat. I reached over and pulled the items out one by one, setting them on the center console. Milk, bread, chicken, chips. There were no peaches anywhere. I figured the cashier must have just accidentally scanned something left over from a previous order, or maybe the scanning machine glitched. It was less than $2, so I didn't think it was worth the effort to turn the car off, go back inside, and complain to the manager. I just crumpled up the receipt, threw it into my cup holder, and drove home, forgetting all about it. Exactly a week went by. It was Tuesday again, and I went back to the exact same store around the same time. It was maybe 11:30 p.m. this time. The parking lot was completely dead. There was only my car and a rusty old pickup truck parked near the very back of the lot by the dumpsters. I grabbed a cart from the front entrance and started walking the aisles, listening to a podcast through my headphones. Everything felt completely normal. I took my time, picked out my groceries, and headed to the front. The same tired-looking cashier was working. I paid, bagged my own groceries, and headed out through the automatic sliding doors into the cool night air. Just like before, I put the bags in the passenger seat, sat in the driver's seat, and checked the receipt before putting the car in drive. I ran my finger down the list of items. Halfway down the slip of paper, right between a pack of coffee filters and a roll of paper towels, was an item that made me stop reading. It clearly read, baby powder, $3.49. I felt uneasy. I definitely didn't buy baby powder. I didn't even walk down the baby supplies aisle. It was completely on the other side of the store from where I had been shopping. Just like with the peaches, I immediately grabbed the bags and searched through them. I emptied everything onto the passenger seat. The item wasn't actually in my bags, but it was definitely on my receipt, and looking at the total at the bottom, I had absolutely been charged for it. I looked back through my windshield at the store. The bright fluorescent lights spilled out through the glass sliding doors into the dark parking lot. I couldn't see anyone inside except the cashier, who was just leaning against the counter, looking down at his phone. I sat there in the quiet car, trying to replay my entire trip inside the store. I had my shopping cart with me the whole time. Well, almost the whole time. I remembered leaving it sitting at the end of an aisle for maybe 10 or 15 seconds while I walked halfway down to grab a specific brand of coffee from the bottom shelf. Could someone have slipped something into my cart while I wasn't looking? But if they did, why wasn't the item actually in my bags when I left? Did the cashier notice an extra item, take it out, but still scan it? None of it made sense. It was just a small, cheap item, but the fact that it happened twice in a row made me feel like someone was intentionally messing with me. I decided I needed to test it to be sure I wasn't just losing my mind. 4 days later, on a Saturday, I went back. This time it was almost midnight. I only actually needed a few small things, but I grabbed a large shopping cart anyway. I was hyper-aware of my surroundings the entire time. I made sure to visually check down the aisles before I walked into them. The store was completely empty. I didn't see another customer the entire time I was inside. I picked up exactly 5 items. I counted them in my head. I kept both of my hands firmly on the cart handle the entire trip around the store. I went to the register and placed the 5 items on the belt. I watched the cashier drag them across the scanner. I watched the screen. I paid, took the receipt directly from his hand, and walked straight to my car without stopping. I got in, locked my doors, and immediately turned on the dome light. I unfolded the receipt and looked at the printed list. There were 6 items listed. The last item on the list, right above the total, was chef's knife, $14.99. My stomach dropped. A knife. That wasn't just a random system glitch or a small, harmless mistake like a can of fruit or some baby powder. I dug through my single plastic bag of groceries, practically tearing the plastic in half. I counted the items, 5 items. There was no knife. I sat there in the absolute quiet of my car, staring blankly at the slip of paper. Something felt very off. I looked up at the front of the store. Through the large glass windows, I saw someone standing near the closed customer service desk. It wasn't the cashier. It was a tall man wearing a dark jacket, just standing perfectly still, facing the windows. He was facing directly toward my car in the parking lot. Because of the glare from the store lights, I couldn't clearly see his face or tell if he was actually looking right at me, but my instincts immediately told me to leave. I put the car in reverse, backed out quickly, and drove out of the parking lot. As I drove down the empty road toward my apartment, I kept checking my rearview mirror every few seconds. Thankfully, no headlights appeared behind me. No one followed me home. When I finally got back to my apartment, I walked inside and made sure the deadbolt was locked tight. I put my few groceries away in the fridge, but I couldn't stop thinking about the receipt. I went back out to my car, dug the older receipts out of the center console cup holder, and brought them inside. I laid all three of them out side by side on my kitchen counter: peaches, baby powder, a large knife. The items felt completely random, but the pattern was undeniable. I tried to convince myself it was just a severe system error, that the store's computer network had been hacked or was just malfunctioning in a really specific way. But that didn't explain the man standing at the window. I didn't go back to that store for over a month. It just completely creeped me out. I changed my routine and started doing all my shopping during the middle of the day at a completely different supermarket on the opposite side of town. But eventually things went back to normal and I started to relax. Then late one Thursday night, I realized I had completely run out of dog food. It was 1:15 a.m. and the only place open within driving distance was the old store. I told myself I would just run in, grab the heavy bag of food, and use the automated self-checkout lanes. If there was no cashier involved, there was no chance for any weird items to be manually added to my order. I pulled into the parking lot. It was empty. The automatic sliding doors opened with a mechanical hum as I walked inside. The store was dead quiet except for the lights humming with that low, irritating buzz they always had. I walked straight to the pet supplies aisle, hoisted the heavy bag of dry food over my shoulder, and headed straight back to the front. I didn't grab a cart. I didn't linger in any other aisles. I walked directly to the self-checkout terminal nearest to the door. I scanned the barcode on the dog food bag. The screen beeped loudly and displayed the item. I hit the green button on the screen to pay with my card. The payment went through and the screen prompted me, asking if I wanted a printed receipt. I hesitated for a second, my finger hovering over the screen, then I tapped yes. The machine whirred loudly and the small piece of thermal paper printed out from the slot. I grabbed it and read it immediately, right there in the store. There were two items listed on the paper: the large bag of dog food, and right beneath it, duct tape, $4.99. I froze completely. I was the only person who had touched that machine. I had only held one item in my hands the entire time. I only scanned one single barcode. I slowly looked around the empty front of the store. The cashier was stocking candy shelves a few aisles over, his back completely turned to me. There was absolutely no one else around. I backed away from the terminal. I didn't even pick up the bag of dog food I just paid for. I just turned around and walked as fast as I could out the sliding doors, stepping out into the cold night air. I practically jogged to my car, got inside, and locked the doors immediately. My hands were shaking a little bit as I put the key into the ignition and started the engine. I turned the steering wheel to leave. As my headlights swept across the glass front of the store, illuminating the entrance, I saw the man in the dark jacket again. He was standing right inside the sliding doors, just watching me as I prepared to drive away. He had one hand resting casually in his jacket pocket. In his other hand, pressed right up against the glass of the door, he was holding a brand new roll of silver duct tape. I hit the gas and drove home faster than I ever have in my life. I don't go out late at night anymore, and I have absolutely never gone back to that grocery store, but I still have those 4 receipts sitting in a drawer in my kitchen. Sometimes I pull them out and look at the items printed on them: peaches, baby powder, a knife, duct tape. I still don't know how he was getting those items onto my receipts without the items ever actually being there. But what bothers me the most is trying to figure out what he was planning to do with them. Has anyone else ever noticed something on their receipt that they know they didn't buy?